Ah, we're adding participants like mad. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. If you could go on your phone or on another window in your computer and go into menti.com and enter the code below. We're starting a survey already. And I would love you to give us some feedback as we get started. We're still there. I may need to restart that one. Hold on half a second. There we go. Nice. Welcome, Naveen.
Hey, Patricia.
So if you've just joined us, the Mentimeter code is on the top of the screen, probably underneath where all of the pictures are. And PJ will be putting that Mentimeter code in the chat. So if you go to menti.com, that's MENTI.com, and put in the code 7631253. We would love to have your opinions. And we're about to get started. So let's go to the next question real quick. So if those are the things that are that the road is supposed to be explaining, what part of the environment does the explaining? And again, we're doing a real quick survey to start out with. We're on menti.com, MENTI.com. And once you get there, the code is 7631253. Cool. All parts of the environment. That's interesting. Geometry, the traffic. There might be a hint in the picture, by the way. Yeah, trees close to the road. That's a good one. And the people. Awesome. So 2 more questions just to get an idea of who's here. You can pick as many of these as you like, but give me an idea of what you see yourself as. Welcome. Good to see engineers. I love the other types of geeks. I think that's where I sit mostly. I'll give this about 30 more seconds. So a bunch of engineers and planners and roadway designers. Oh, and not a geek at all. And again, you can pick as many of these as you like. Overflow is good. All right, we're going to move to the next one. Now I need you to make a decision. This is similar to the last one, but if you had to put yourself in one bucket, which one would you put yourself in? Well, fantastic. I am so glad to see you all here today. I'm going to let this keep running so that everybody can get into the system, because we're going to use this to kind of categorize the results we get in some of the other questions. My name is Dr. Patricia Tice, and oh, hold on. My apologies. And today we're going to be talking about driver mental frameworks. And the big focus is on how the built environment shapes a driver's psychological response. Now, we have in the link, we're going to do some housekeeping real quick. If you want to have PE or AICP credit for this, there is a link in the chat that for a Google Doc. And sometime by the end of this, or within an hour of the end of this presentation, we'd like you to go through and put in that link. It's a Google form, your name and your email. And if you have a PE, you need to put your PE number in there so that we can keep record of who's getting credit and send you out forms as they need to be sent. The AICP credit is already listed in the AICP website, and the link is there. So after you're done with this, you can actually go directly there and enter into your certification management system, and you can put this in right immediately as soon as we're done. We're going to have 3 major sections. We're first going to talk about the theory and the data, and then we're going to take a 10-minute Mentimeter break after that. That'll give you some time to get up and move around if you need to, but we'll be able to keep the discussion going during that time too. And then we'll have a slightly longer presentation about speed prediction, where we're going to get into the nuts and bolts and the really intense details on what each variable does to a driver's speed. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the implications of this research and what we think it means in terms of design. So let's just get at it. In terms of background, I have lived here in Florida for all of my life, or nearly all of it, and my family has been here for 7 generations. I know that's a little rare, especially in Florida, where everybody seems to be coming from somewhere else. We've been living the suburban dream, and I've been practicing for 27 years. But as I've been practicing, there were some things that came across my desk that were puzzling. Things like, why in the world does this work? And it does. It works really well for everybody, bicyclists, pedestrians, and everybody, but this doesn't. The geometry is nearly identical. The environment is just as walkable out by the buildings, but the top one works extraordinarily well, even though it's very wide, but the bottom one is very difficult for all users, roadway users and drivers alike. It's very uncomfortable for everyone. Why in the world do I need to go this fast? And everybody else does, by the way. This is pretty ordinary for this road. And if these trees are a serious issue with clear zone, why don't we have more fatal and serious injuries? The red ones are fatal. This is the last 5 years. And they're not actually in places where trees are. And the serious injuries are here. Those actually are collisions with trees. But if they're that serious, then why don't we have any more of those? And then I ran across this. I had a community that called me to do a traffic calming study. And this is one of those where you lay the hoses out, you do the count, and you start wondering why you were there. Because the average speed was 20 miles an hour and the 85th percentile speed was 25. And you're wondering, how in the world do I do this somewhere else? What problem do you have? So it turns out when you're doing a traffic calming study, you probably need to be looking at the 95th percentile, not the 85th. There was only 1 or 2 drivers that were giving them grief, and often that's the case when you're looking at speed problems. So we know we have a pedestrian fatality problem, and it's easy to blame distraction due to devices. The iPhone was released at the end of 2007, and as the market penetration has gone up, our pedestrian fatalities have gone up with it. Nice, simple story, right? Only design may be a part of this problem. These are the number of complete streets policies that have been adopted throughout the US. That's not to say that complete streets policies are bad, but I don't know about you, the curve matches a little better. And I suspect we have met the enemy, and he is us. So the issue is that if you are not skilled at designing a complete street, if this is brand new to you, you could actually make things worse by adding in those multimodal facilities. That doesn't mean you don't want to try. It just means that you need to have some expertise in doing that. There are places that are essentially traps. And this would be one of those where you're looking to see, can you find the pedestrian? So the pedestrian is easy to find, but a lot of people miss the 2 cyclists that are actually right behind the pedestrian. And if you can't see those pedestrians and cyclists, you may be in trouble. So we know that an urban environment gets a different behavior. Our research question was why? And can we do it again? Can we design our environments so that we get better behavior all the time? It turned into a question of, do we even want to? But we'll get to that in a little bit. So we started out with an audacious goal. Can we design for a target speed? And then decided that that goal actually wasn't good enough. Can we get an attitude out of our drivers that will cause them to be at the right speed and focus too? And then we kind of just stepped back and said, well, that's really not it either. What is it that's actually driving that attitude? Why are they giving us good attention when they're giving it to us? So the why is just as crucial as the how. So our goal was to go from this to this. And we needed to know how to test it. So we could take the data, but why? But how do you test it? So thought about a simulator, but we're really on a fishing expedition. We don't know what we're looking for yet. And when you don't understand what you're looking for, you need things to be as random and unpredictable as you can, because you're going to get surprised along the way. And so we went to the SHRP2 naturalistic driving study. This probably was the best use of federal funds I've ever seen. They took about 3,300 vehicles and they instrumented each vehicle up with about 100 different instruments, and they just let people drive for a year. That created 4 petabytes of data, over half of it in video, which means that you can go and query that database and get information out of that data about how people behave in normal everyday situations. And so we picked 200 locations, 100 in Tampa and 100 in Seattle. And we selected them regionally, 3 points in each major neighborhood, an arterial, a collector, and a local street. We tried to pick the mid-block as far away from signals as we can get them. 1 point in each direction, so we're not catching behavior in one direction and not the other. And we asked them to give us the data for 10 drives in each location, the 10 that were the closest to the 85th percentile speed during the daytime, or at least the active time. We wanted to see what the environment was actually causing the driver to choose, not what the transient behaviors would be. Say if there was a pedestrian that randomly crossed their path, or if they had to stop at a stoplight, we wanted to see as close to free flow as we could get. And they gave us 1 second of data, which gave us 10 readings during that second. And we asked for 2 attention variables. The first one was 10 times a second, tell us, are they on task or off task? If I were doing this again, I probably would have done 3 seconds, not 1. But essentially, it's eyes on the road. Are they looking at the roadway or are at their mirrors, or are they looking around at something else? And then multitasking. So they'd give us a high-level list of what tasks they were doing. And we actually counted the number of tasks. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then on a whim, we asked, are there vulnerable users present in that environment as they're driving through? Didn't realize at the time how important that would be. And while they were collecting all of that data out of the video, we went through and started measuring. So in all of those 200 locations, we measured anything and everything we possibly could. We even made up stuff, brand new measures that I hadn't seen before. So we measured corridor width 6 different ways, all the way from lane width up to building height width. And so each one of those measures a different type of interaction with the environment. So the lane width has to do with how you're moving in that lane, but the width at eye height is just something that you see. And the outside curb edge is the right of way. That's something completely different. And we didn't know which one would matter. And then we also needed a human activity proxy. And for that, we used doorway density. We measured the number of doorways in the corridor and then divided it by the number of 100 feet in the block face. So number of feet in the block face divided by 100 feet, just to get a round number. And then we start throwing it into all of these multivariate analysis. Now, multivariate analysis is very difficult to digest if you haven't done a lot of statistics lately, and a lot of practitioners haven't. So I'm going to give you a real quick overview on what that looks like. A lot of what we did was linear regression because it's simple, especially in terms of speed prediction. It creates a simple formula on the back end, and it's essentially trying to fit your data points to a line. You could do that in multiple variables, and you end up, if you've got 2 variables, you've got a plane. You've got 3 variables, you've got a space. And as the dimensions get higher, you go into hyperplanes. But essentially, you're just fitting the data to a line. Now, what happens if your data isn't a line? Well, you can transform it into a line most of the time. So if it's a logarithmic equation, you can actually change your data to be a logarithmic, or use a logarithmic formula to turn that into a line. And here's an example. So for instance, this is the old trip generation formula for shopping centers. And you can see they fitted a logarithmic equation to the data. Here's an example from our research. This was the width at eye height, and this was the speed at the 85th percentile speed that was uncongested. And you can see it's a logarithmic equation. When you take the log of that, you end up with the data basically fitting a straight line, which is awesome because then I can fit that with a regression equation. But that's not the only tool in our toolbox. You can also use something called an econometric model. And these models use an S-curve. And they generally, in the most general sense, they're trying to identify the difference between someone choosing yes or no. You can actually extend that to different levels of yes or no, but essentially you're trying to figure out whether a person, given a whole bunch of information and a whole bunch of things to decide from, they've got one choice to make, but a lot of factors that are going to go into that choice. Are they going to decide yes or no? And so this is the kind of thing that tells you whether or not you've hit the straw that broke the camel's back. So as you go along the line, you're ending up adding up those factors. And at some point, you begin to get high enough that you go from a no to a yes. And those are the kinds of things that when you add factors together, you can see how the variables interact. Now, a multivariate analysis is a lot like icing a cake. The type of cake you have determines the type of frostings and add-ins you're going to put with it. If you've got a very simple cake, you want a really rich, intense icing. If you've got a complex cake, you want a very simple, just sweet icing, but not nearly as complex because you don't want to overshadow the cake. And you're always looking to see what flavors would balance it out to make an overall presentation. It's the same thing in a multivariate analysis. Some variables capture an awful lot of effects. They're a lot like the carrot cake. And you can only put one variable type in a model at a time. So for instance, if we look at our corridor widths, we can't put every single one of those in at the same time. That'd be a Neapolitan cake. And unfortunately, we have people, the models just don't work that way. So if you've got a variable like the width at eye height that takes into account an awful lot of things at the same time, it's kind of like having a carrot cake. And you want to ice that with something that's very simple. So what you see in the carrot cake comes shining through. But if you're using something like the outside curb edge, that's a very simple measurement. It doesn't take a lot of other environmental things into account. And we can see in the model the other pieces that actually matter. So sometimes when you have a very simple variable that's the base of your model, you can actually see the other pieces that add up to it. But if you have a very complex variable that starts your model, you don't end up anything else showing up as significant. And that's one of the things that we faced. So a lot of the models I'm going to show you next are really very simple outside curb edge models. And we're going to start with time on task. So remember, we asked them, is the driver focused or not 10 times a second, okay, at that 1 second mid-block. And at first we thought we were measuring the driver's attention, but it turns out we were just measuring whether the driver had their eyes on the road. And the biggest clue to that is that when you have a person in the environment, a vulnerable user, the attention that the driver gave dropped just a little bit, not a lot, just a little, but it was very significant. It was always happening. And what we're seeing here is that drivers' eyes are drawn to the people that are in the space. Now, they don't always see it, but they do get drawn to it when they do. Local streets get more attention than arterials and collectors. They also have more conflicts. And so you end up having to focus on more than just the roadway when you're in a local street. This is kind of a duh. As the roadway gets more complex, you got to keep your eyes on the road more. That's very simple. On-street parking dropped the time on task. And that's because drivers are actually looking to see if somebody's going to jump out between the cars or if the cars are going to start moving out. And so they're looking at more than just the driving task itself. They're actually paying attention to the things on the side of the road. And that's a good thing. It's just a complex thing. There's also an interaction between the number of lanes and the pavement width. So as the width gets wider, you don't have to focus as much on the roadway. But as you add more lanes, you add more complexity, and you have to go back to paying attention to the roadway. Now, these two things balance out until you get up to about 4 lanes. So you got more room, you don't have to pay as much attention. You add more lanes, you have to pay more attention because it's more complex. At 4 lanes, this evens out. At 6 lanes, you start losing the driver's attention entirely. It's gone. And this is a spoiler alert. Think about how wide 4 lanes are. So if you've got 4 12-foot wide lanes, that's 48 feet wide. You're hitting right around 50 feet. How wide is 5? Now you're at 60 feet. And that may be an interesting number. So we also looked at multitasking, and they gave us a list of the things that each driver was doing at the same time. And this was just across the entire second. But one of those variables was not like the others. And this is the definition of that variable. The driver's looking outside of the vehicle in the direction of a non-driving related object on the side of the road. Could be a pedestrian, animals, or other vehicles, but it has to be non-driving related. Well, to me, that's not a distraction. That's situational awareness. And that's a really important part of driving in an urban environment. So we coded that a little differently. So if the driver was completely on task, we coded that as a 0. If there was only external distraction, that's not the same as completely on task, but it may actually be in the same category. So we gave that a 1. If there were 2 simultaneous tasks, that got a 2, and then 3 or more was 3. And there were some that were 4 or 5. So it's actually pretty common for people to be doing multiple things at the same time. So we did a model for that. And we saw the same trade-off between pavement width and the number of lanes. And I'll give you some numbers here so I can show you how this actually works. So there's a 0 because our base is one directional lane. So that's 2 lanes in each direction, but 1 lane in your direction. If you've got a 20-foot wide roadway, then you get a 0.1 for the number that goes into the formula. It tells you where you're sitting. Okay, so that's a slight increase. At 4 12-foot lanes, you now have a decrease in your attention because it's 2 lane. We're now at 2 lanes, right? Or a decrease in multitasking because it's 2 lanes. They're going to have to give you more attention because there's more complexity. But now you've got 48 feet wide, and the 2 of those numbers balance out almost dead even. So if you add in a sidewalk to that, now they're really having to pay attention because the sidewalk will actually increase their attention. At 6 lanes, you do those same calculations and you're getting a really positive number now, which means you're getting a lot of multitasking going on. Suburban sidewalks decreased multitasking, but urban sidewalks are kind of de rigueur. Everybody expects them to be there, so there's a little bit of rebalancing. A wide sidewalk is a really normal thing in an urban setting, so it doesn't really help your attention as much. Longer sight lines increased multitasking. So if you're going from a city block to a half a mile spacing on your sight distance, you pretty much increased your multitasking levels by a factor of 8. That's a huge jump. A high doorway density increases multitasking. Okay, that's if you have more, or decreases multitasking, excuse me. So if you've got more people there, you're going to have to pay attention. So you're not going to be able to do as many other things. A city block with blank walls on one side, on just each wall, is going to give you a small number. A city block with liner retail, where you've got 10 or 15 doors going down it, may have an impact that's 4 or 5 times as much. So you're going to get even less multitasking going on the more doors you have. But we still haven't gotten to why. And we still haven't started to talk about that carrot cake width at eye height issue. So why would width at eye height be such a intense variable? Why does it account for so much? So we broke it out and started looking at each individual ingredient by itself. So when you're looking at this, we took every single variable and we did an individual statistical analysis for each variable by itself. So how does the drive lane width relate to time on task and multitasking? And then also, how does that variable predict whether or not you'd have a vulnerable user in the space? And then we lined them all up, so we're looking at them all together. And there were a whole bunch of things at the top that moved together. And a lot of them were very visible, but not all of them. So there were high correlations between attention and vulnerable user presence for some things, but not for all things. Just because you had vulnerable users there when that variable was high didn't necessarily mean that variable changed your attention level. And that was really puzzling. So why would it matter sometimes and why wouldn't it matter other times? Things like walk score don't actually have anything to do with what the environment looks like, and yet it seems to have a really big impact across the board. So I was talking with a friend of mine trying to ponder through what all this data meant. He's a practicing psychiatrist, and he drops this bomb on me. He says, well, you know, most driving's in a hypnotic state anyway. I'm going, we talked about highway hypnosis in the 60s, but that was a very long time ago. And highway hypnosis was really an impact on fatigue. We kind of discounted it. So what are you talking about? I know you're not talking about fatigue. What is it that you think that's important about hypnosis? Well, he said, go look up what hypnosis actually is. So I dutifully went and looked it up. And it turns out when a person hypnotizes you, it increases your ability to pay attention to what they cued you to, but without watching yourself do it. So when the guy says, every time I say this word, cluck like a chicken, your brain decides it's going to watch for that word at a really, really high level, but it's going to turn off your ability to actually watch yourself watch for the word. And that's exactly what you do when you're driving. When you're driving, you quit watching yourself drive. And it turns out there's two levels of watching yourself. One of them that we normally think about is something called higher order thinking. And it's very tied in with words. So you know you're watching yourself. It's very logical. It's very processed, and you remember it. But there's also a level of metacognition, watching yourself, that's called phenomenological. And it's basically watching yourself see things, but it's not necessarily talking to yourself about it. It's all about monitoring and your sensory perception. You can ask yourself, or someone can ask you in the moment about it, and you'll be able to answer questions about it, but you won't be able to remember it later. The picture here is of a study that was about, it was called Walking Without Awareness. And they stuck this sign on the sidewalk. And if the person who was walking by was unconscious of the sign, they'd run into it. And nobody ran into the sign. Everybody went around it. But they would stop them at the end of the block and ask them, did they see a sign and what was on the sign? And most of the people couldn't remember seeing the sign. And the few who did remember seeing it had no memory of what was on it. So even though they responded to it consciously with a conscious change in their behavior, they didn't remember any of it later. And driving involves an awful lot of that kind of behavior. We call that driving without awareness. And like I said, once you learn to drive, you quit watching yourself. And it's this kind of thing. So when you so she realizes she's not paying attention. She looks around to regain her situational awareness, and then she cusses herself out for not paying attention. Well, it turns out she probably was paying attention. But when you start throwing faces into the mix, or human biological movement, that changes your level of consciousness, because we are reflexively drawn to the human face and form. This was a study where they put this picture in front of people with eye tracking on, and 2/3 of the time, the very first thing their eyes landed on was the lady's face. You look at faces first and you come back to them over and over again. Facial recognition is tied into the dopamine and oxytocin pathways, which means that every time you decode that something is a face, just determine that it is a face, you get a dopamine reward. It's not a big one, it's a really small one, but anything that your body is rewarding gets priority over everything else. Now, if that face is familiar or a face or smiling at you, you get an oxytocin hit too. That's a double reward. You see faces even when they're not there, and we get rewarded when we see faces even before you're conscious of them. So the wave that we see in brainwave patterns that corresponds to recognizing that something is a face happens at 170 milliseconds. Conscious thought doesn't start until about 300 milliseconds. And it turns out if it's your own face, you only need 20 milliseconds to actually get the dopamine hit tied to seeing your own face. That mirror neuron system also runs on dopamine. That's the system that when you raise your hand and wave it at somebody, there's a part of their brain that will actually raise a hand and wave it so you can decode what that person did. That's how babies learn empathy, because when their mom smiles, that mirror neuron system causes them to make the exact same facial expression. And when they make that facial expression, they feel internally what the mom feels, because facial expressions are hardwired. You feel the facial expression you make. And so these are very, very primitive, very biologically critical systems that all run on dopamine. So let's look at those numbers again. So up here, we have a whole bunch of things that have to do with corridor width at the top of the list. Now, we reordered this based on multitasking, so it's going to look a little different. And it turns out that the corridor width has a lot to do with whether or not you can see a vulnerable user in the space. Lane width doesn't have anything to do with seeing people, but it does add up. It's still critical, but the effect size, this third column is the effect size. It's how important that variable is, how big an impact it has. The second column tells you whether it matters. The third column tells you how big an impact it has. So when you look at the lane width, it has a really small impact, but it really matters statistically. We know it makes a difference. It's just a very small difference. More sidewalks mean more people. A really high doorway density matters across the board. It changes multitasking, time on task, and it predicts whether or not you're going to have vulnerable users in the space. If you've got more doors, you usually have more people there. Short blocks and lots of driveways also mean seeing lots of people. And of course, there's a mechanical effect to having all of those interruptions. So every time you get an interruption, you have to reorient your attention. That's actually adding to your ability to hold attention too. This is a weird one though. Just because you have higher land use density does not necessarily mean you've increased the driver's attention. And we call this the downtown Tampa effect. So you have this really high land use density. You've got skyscrapers. So you should have a lot of land use there and a lot of people there. But what happens is that people would drive into Tampa, especially in 2011 when this data set was taken. It's not that way anymore. But people would drive into downtown, into their parking garage under the building, take an elevator up to their office, and then take the elevator back down at the end of the day and go home in their cars without ever being on the street. And so people drove through downtown Tampa as if it were a freeway because they never saw anyone there. And that happens. I would call that, and a lot of urban designers would call that a suburban core. This is not urban, it's actually suburban. Even though you've got skyscrapers, it's still not an urban setting. So our surprise takeaway was that it was never about what you build. We were looking for a magic bullet in what we were building in the environment. It was all about whether or not there were people there in that environment for someone to see as they're driving by. And so we created this theory. It's a psychological model that's called the conditioned anticipation of people. So when you see people, you get a dopamine hit. When you see you often see people in urban environments and you get a dopamine hit while you're there. That means that as you start seeing the urban environment, even if there's not people there, you expect to see them, and so you get the dopamine hit. Now, what happens when you get to too many people, we're not quite sure yet, but we'd really like to know. These cap environments give you an advantage in those spaces that is neurological and primal. So if you don't have people in that environment on a regular basis, you're actually losing a lot of your advantage. And this is the way the cycle works. So you have a driver who comes there and he says, I haven't seen anyone there before. So he's not anticipating anyone there now. He gets there and he doesn't see anyone there. There's no reward for seeing anyone there. And so he decides he can drive fast because that's a different kind of reward, right? The pedestrians and bicyclists that are there look at that and say, wow, people are driving really fast here. It's dangerous. I don't want to be here, which then means that the next driver that comes along doesn't see any people there. And this cycles downward. Now you could break that cycle by actually getting people there. And as that happens, driver's speed begins to decrease. It doesn't happen quickly, but it does happen. The key thing is that there are limitations on how far you can actually see as a human being. And those limitations don't stop when you're a driver. You can see all facial expressions at about 90 feet, and that's where your highest reward levels are. You can see extreme expressions out to 135 feet. You can't see expressions anymore, but you can see body movement and posture out to 150 feet. So you're still getting a reward, not as big a one. But you're only really looking at 20 degrees from center, particularly as you're going down a corridor. So you're not really looking at both sides off on the side. Usually you're looking at a 20-degree window. So let's take this out and look at this in a plan view. So when you put those numbers onto a plan view, it turns out that at 90-foot window, the 90-foot in length turns into a 60-foot wide corridor. Now that 60-foot wide corridor keeps popping up in a lot of different places. So that 60 to 90-foot range is really where the highest level of reward is going to happen for each driver. And that's why visual corridor width mattered. So what's going on in that 60-foot window is what your brain is actually looking to figure out. And it turns out it pops up in other places too. So we know that the faster you drive, the narrower you're looking. You're not looking at as much of your visual field. Well, when we take this into plan view, it turns out the people who did the research never actually considered how far ahead the driver was actually looking. So if you're only going 18 miles an hour, you're not going to be looking that far in front of you. But if you're going 50 or 60, you're going to look a whole lot farther down the road. And those shapes correspond to a different width in the roadway. So when we put that in a plan view, it turns out no matter how fast you're going, you're still basically looking at a 60-foot wide corridor. Even at 68 miles an hour, you're still narrowing your cone of vision out to a 60-foot wide corridor. That's a very interesting thing to me. And there's a speed issue too. So if you're going too fast, it actually takes time. Remember, we said it took 170 milliseconds to process a face. It takes time to process human presence. So if you're going too fast, there's not enough time to process that there's someone there. And we think that limit is around 40 miles an hour. You see those little red blobs going by? Well, we didn't. We didn't see them until about the fourth time we went through the video. Those are actually people on the side of the road. And at 36 miles an hour, even though they're only about 20, maybe 30 feet at the most away from you, they're basically outside of your normal cone of vision. And you start adding traffic in, and you don't see hardly anything at all. Now, the other thing that goes into the way people drive is interruptions. So it's one thing to grab someone's attention because they see people or they anticipate seeing people, but you also have to keep it. And part of keeping it is giving people interruptions, because every interruption you give a driver reorients their attention to the environment. So to get speed down, you have to get their attention, and you have to keep it. And that means you've got three things that you can use to control their attention. The first one is getting people into the space, and that is really the most critical variable. The second one is making sure that they're close enough that the driver can actually see them without being unsafe, obviously. And then giving the driver a lot of novelty and change as they're traveling down their pathway. So they've got good reasons to actually reorient their attention to the environment. They're not getting bored. And so the next section we're going to talk about is predicting speed. But we're going to take a really quick Mentimeter break. So if you logged out of Mentimeter, you can go right back into it. Here's the code. It's 763125.3. And I'm going to switch screens over to our next question. So we ended up with a whole bunch of people here. Glad 52 different people here. So we got the next question. Out of this last discussion, I think this is a word cloud. So what do you think was the biggest surprise? And we'll do this for a few minutes. If you need to go take a break, this is the time to go do it. We're just going to take some feedback right now. And I know it's going to take a little bit to log into this. So let's see, we're supposed to be scrolling. We may have to get out of this. Let's look at the answers. Huh? Oh. Yeah. The field of view remains the same. The link between the complete streets and ped fatalities versus ice, that's an interesting one to me too. The 60-foot, oh yeah, that downtown Tampa thing really gets me. The impact of dopamine. Building height. I'm going to get rid of that now. You know, there's a big difference between watching paint dry and watching people. Faces are really, really critical. Doorway density. Are there any questions real quick? You can go ahead and put it. 2 questions. Okay, let's look at those questions real quick. Where's the Q&A? Over there. How do you explain the 60 feet the drivers see is not affected by speed? Okay. When we looked at the perceptual narrowing research, in that perceptual narrowing research, they had a shape. We showed that a few minutes ago. I can pull that up and again in a second. They had a shape that showed how wide the driver was actually looking. Well, that study was done in a simulator. And so the driver was actually looking at just a screen, but they were focusing at a different height in that screen. So when you take into account how far ahead the driver is looking, rather than looking really close up, they're looking farther away. When you take that into account, you begin to see that when you narrow that angle down to the angle that they were seeing, it turns out that the circle that they're looking at is still 60 feet wide. And I have an image of that back in here. I don't want to go. Yeah, we can go there for a second. We'll go back there for just a second. So you see this right here? We took the information that was in the study, and we assumed that at that slower speed, they were basically using their entire field of view. And if they needed to, they could see out to 60 feet wide, but they didn't necessarily have to. But as they got faster, each of these ovals represents where their eyes are focusing. And as they got faster, we narrowed down that field of view from the full 20 degrees down to basically 80% of that 20 degrees. And it turns out that that angle gives you a window about 60 feet wide. I hope that answers your question. We're going to go back to the Mentimeter. And the most, I think, oh, that's an interesting observation that cell phones aren't necessarily the main cause of pedestrian deaths. Well, we've kind of slowed down. Oh, we got another question here down here. Both of them are reward questions. So one of the questions that was asked in the Mentimeter was, how does the model get impacted if we're talking about a cortisol or stress level rather than a dopamine reward? Well, both of them actually feed into attention. If your stress level increases, your attention levels also increase. So it's almost an even trade. They're both the impact goes in the same direction. Both of them are increasing your ability to actually pay attention. I have a friend of mine who's actually doing research on reaction times. And what he found was that your reaction time dramatically decreases as the probability of a crash increases. So if you see a pedestrian and he's down the sidewalk a ways, your reaction time is pretty close to ordinary. If that pedestrian is actually standing at the crosswalk and ready to cross, your reaction time drops really dramatically. It's not a fixed quantity. And the reason that happens is because your attention level has been elevated. So good question. We're going to go on to the next. Streets do need to invite people. We'll go on to the next Mentimeter question. Besides posted speed, what else do you think we could measure that might impact drivers? So obviously we know that posted speed might matter, right? So are there other things, other variables? Is there something else in the environment that you think might make a difference in the way that drivers move, in the way they pay attention and how fast they go? What other things might matter? Any ideas? Lighting. How would you define friction? Is there a way we could actually measure friction? Oh, whether or not there were passengers there. That's an interesting thing. Sign clutter. I did actually try to measure that. It's not an easy thing to measure, but it can be done. You can use the bit rate on the signs, or the bit rate in terms of the number of signs. Other people's speeds, yes. Weather. The number of how often those interruptions come. I was actually thinking about measuring them in terms of how often or how quickly those interruptions come at the driver. You know, what's the time rate of the interruptions? Truck traffic, dogs, things other than people. Yeah. Well, what's interesting about dogs is that they still have faces, and we still actually see them as faces. So it may not be that big of a difference. Weaving. Well, that's an interesting one. Surface, oh yeah, surface. What happens if it's brick, not just concrete or asphalt? How do we measure novelty? The physical channelization, that's actually a really interesting one too. Building proximity, we did measure that one. But we could actually measure it in terms of the distance to the individual driver. That would be interesting. The pace of the roadway. Oh, familiarity. I like that. How knowledgeable is the driver? If we were actually doing another NDS, and we've actually thought about that, doing an NDS where we're watching their brain activity. It would be interesting to know how knowledgeable that driver was of the area. I saw vegetation in there, trees. I did try to measure trees in several different ways. Linear trees did make a difference, but not as big a difference as I had expected. So it's not just, there also weren't an awful lot of them in the data set. So the jury's out on that one. Racial bias. Art. I saw some art in there. Those are some great questions. All right, I'm going to give you a question now to anticipate the next section. Oh, hold on, back up. So which one do you think is going to have the biggest impact on speed? And PJ tells me I have a question in the Q&A. So if we recognize animal faces are the same, theoretically, no, we're not sacrificing animals. What about mannequins is actually an interesting question. We're not quite sure. And I am actually very curious about that. I'd really like to know. It runs the risk. I've actually had some ideas about maybe what would happen if you put like a very tall vertical sign right next to a crosswalk and showed in the sign, you're in the video sign, a picture of who was actually standing there at the crosswalk trying to cross. Would that change the response to the crosswalk? I suspect it would, but I think you would actually have to time that with the signals so that you're only showing it at times that it doesn't actually conflict with people paying attention to what's going on in the intersection. So it'd have to be a very sophisticated system. Do people react to cyclists with helmets on if drivers can't see their faces? I don't know yet. I'm actually more concerned about the fact that they're hunched over than the fact that they can't see their faces, because you can still get the same impact from biological movement. But if a cyclist is hunched over and doesn't actually look like the shape of a human being anymore, I'm not quite sure how well that's going to work. Yes, there are legs movement, but can you see them? This is where my striped socks come in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Can you see their legs? Are their legs conspicuous enough to actually see them moving? It's an interesting question. In Europe, they have speed feedback signs with faces smiling if you do the proper speed. I would love to see whether or not that actually works. I don't know about that, but and you could see the question. We're not thinking about sacrificing animals, but if it's a blighted area, stray dogs would actually make roadways safer. It's a hard question to know. I suspect it might, but that's my suspicion. We don't have any data on that. I'm with you on that, Barb. Yeah. I don't think a dead animal works the same way that a live one would. Although, seeing a deer alive on the side of the road is really very attention getting, especially when it gets close to the road, and it should be, because it's very dangerous. So our bets are on sight distance. Most of our bets are on sight distance. But we got a close runner up with corridor width. Yeah, the animal silhouette signs are really interesting. I like the little kid silhouette signs where they stick them out. Your kid that's in the shape of a child with a flag saying children playing in the street. And we'll talk about children playing in the street in a little bit. So, no more open questions for the moment. Did we give you enough time to take a break? Are we back at it? About ready? PJ says we're good. So we're going to move on because this next section is very intense and has a lot of information in it. And that means that I need to shift windows. And we're going to go to this one. So we're going to be talking about speed now. And we're going to get into the details, hardcore details. We've had 35 years of trying to predict. Oh, was there a question there? Well, we'll go on for a little bit. Okay. We've had 35 years of predicting speed choice. And I want to emphasize that speed is actually still a choice. It is more of a choice in some environments than others. You have more latitude in your choice in some places than you have others. And we started with this idea of point mass physics. This goes all the way back to the 80s or even earlier. And they'd use things like stopping sight distance or curves or super elevation. And you could use that. They were design inputs into the roadway in the first place. But those inputs came from measuring the way people responded to roads in real life. In the late 90s, early 2000s, around 2005, we start seeing speed choice equations that begin to take into account the social environment itself. So driveway spacing in a residential area, the number of access points per 1,000 feet, Is there stuff on the side or is there not? Is it enclosed with woods around? All of those questions began to get asked, and we get some answers in the literature. But both of these are really very tied into the physics of the drive. The physics imposes risks and the driver adjusts to those risks. We were actually trying to look at this from a different point of view. We were trying to figure out what is it that they can see, what holds their attention, and what engages their self-monitoring. And so the variables that we're using are really different from the variables that we've used before. That's not to say that the variables that they've used to analyze this before are not important. They are. They matter. It's just we're adding a whole new set. And the problem is that when you're in a low-speed environment, all of those point mass physical environmental impacts don't make as big of a difference. When you're in a low-speed environment, you're dealing with social interactions. All of the risks involved are social, and they're not risks to the driver. They're risks to the vulnerable users. And so if those risks are not perceived by the driver, they have no threats to themselves, and they don't adjust their behavior. So having social cues or environmental cues that will elevate their anticipation that they're going to see people is going to have the biggest opportunity of changing their behavior in these social environments. Now, I've done this presentation or a similar presentation about 12 times now. And several of the times we talked about our initial speed equation. And you can see that speed equation up here in the top right corner. It's a very simple 3-variable equation, but several of the variables are difficult to measure. It includes the width at eye height. So that's that visual corridor width, the tunnel that the driver is driving through, and the doorway density, which is also not something you can measure in bulk. It's easy enough to measure it if you can put yourself in the corridor, but it's not something you could put into GIS. Block length you can put in GIS, that's an easy one. And we got some new data. We asked Virginia Tech for some new data. And originally, when we took our data samples, we took a 5-second time slice to make sure that we were capturing the middle of the block, not the ends, just the middle. Well, the data that we got from Virginia Tech took the average over the entire length of that segment. And so their data includes some of the things that are going on in the block ends. And so it's a little bit of apples and oranges. But as you can see on this graph over here, we plotted them together. There's a few outliers here and there where what we measured was a little different than what they measured. But in the whole, there's fairly good agreement. So there's a little bit of overlap. I think we could still use them both. And then we tested them against real life data. I happen to still practice as an engineer, and so I'd been doing speed studies. And I had real speed study data that I could actually compare our formulas to from a completely different suburban region. Now, I'll tell you, this original formula still seems to work the best out of all of the formulas that I've tested. We've done over 100 different equation combinations. We can get the standard deviation down in terms of the data set that we measured, but it's not as transferable. It doesn't work as well when you're going to a completely different environment. So these are the caveats. The other thing is that the variables we're dealing with, the width at eye height and the doorway density, are really hard to measure at scale. So it's a cool formula. It's very simple. It's easy to remember, but it's got some drawbacks. And the neat thing about the original formula was that we could actually take the pieces of the formula apart and tell what was going on in the corridor from each individual piece. So if you were to run the equation with just the corridor width alone, not worry about the other two variables, we would actually get the speeds that you see at nighttime. Use the block length, because obviously block length is still there at night, but just the corridor width and the block length and the constant, we would actually get a good prediction for how fast people were going at night. There'd be occasional outliers, but that's understandable. It predicted pretty well. And as you can see, the corridor width alone gives you a huge change. So the contexts are very different contexts, but the difference between the two of them has a lot to do with how wide that corridor is perceived by the driver. Now, we could also use the same equation to look at the difference between what happens in the day and what happens in the night. And that was captured by the doorway density number. So if you use the prediction with all the variables together, we actually got the speed that happened during the daytime. When you did the prediction without the doorway density, like I said earlier, you got the speed that happened at night. That's a pretty cool thing to be able to do. What's interesting is that schools kind of throw a monkey in the wrench. This happens to be, if you're looking really closely, you could see there's a school crossing sign here in the roadway. And the place that we were looking at right here, the place we got this data, was actually a school crossing. And so you can actually see how the speed dramatically changed during the time of day when people knew that children would be crossing. There's always a crossing guard there during that time of day because it is a fairly dangerous crossing. But you could see that doorway, the human presence makes a big difference in how fast people choose to drive. And in this case, we're really talking about a conscious choice, or a subconscious choice at least. So people recognize that there's going to be a human being there that they would get rewarded by, that would elevate their cortisol level, that would actually be in danger, and they change their behavior specifically to address that threat. Now, when we were doing the suburban field testing, it was a really wide range of contexts, but mostly suburban. But we're talking about Orange County, Florida here. So we got some unusual places. Like, for instance, this was one of the locations we were looking at, and it's in the tourist area. So there's strip shopping centers. There's a Walmart right here. It looks like a highway kind of roadway, and yet you're right here within view of the Orlando Eye. So you have a really wide range of users. You have tourists here, you have locals here, you have suburban behavior, and a lot of uncertainty. And that was kind of neat because we could see when the equations fail, because we had a lot of situations where the equations could fail because there was something weird going on. And the question we were trying to answer with this field testing was, how transferable are these prediction equations? When do they work and when don't they work? And what are the circumstances that are going to throw the predictions off? And these are some of the things that we found. So we know that some variables work better than others. Several of the variables gave a really good correlation within the data set, but it didn't work as well when we tested them out. When the conditions in the test segment were similar to our data set, it predicted pretty well. If you have an uninterrupted length that was really, really long, and we had some of those in the data set, but not a lot, the predictions weren't as good. If the walk score was over 50, the predictions were great. If it was under 50, really kind of low, it's not as much an impact in the way people drive when the walk score actually gets that low. And so in areas like Tampa, walk score didn't show up as a variable that was all that critical, and when it did, it was very critical. At any rate, caveats. So if you've got a roadway like this one, and you can see what this looks like, this is basically a highway in the middle of a suburban setting that's very, very densely developed and has an awful lot of walking in it. So this is somewhere between a highway and a street. It's not quite a street, but it's also not quite a highway either. And so it's kind of in between. The speeds are lower than our prediction formulas would give you because the variables that go into the formula are all really large. But the highway prediction formulas are probably going to underestimate the speed a little bit. So we're talking about an area that's a little bit in between. And it's surprising how often these come up. This is one of the issues with using context classification blindly. Is in this area or in areas similar to it, you might have a C3 or a C4 context, but this is acting like and looks like a C2 kind of context. And the facility itself may actually behave more like C2 than C3 or C4. So these are things to keep in the back of your mind as you're designing roadways. Another caveat, lost people don't drive like locals. Now, that seems like a duh. When you're lost, you're going to be looking around and you're kind of confused. And so you're not going to drive as quickly. And we saw that a lot with tourists. But the other place that we saw that, or we heard reports of that, were in places like government centers. So you have a very dense urban center around the courthouse, and you have people who are coming there on jury duty who normally drive in suburban areas, but all of a sudden they're in a very dense downtown area and they drive like they're still in the suburban area. And I've heard complaints about this frequently, that just because when you get an awful lot of people that are there that are not familiar with the environment, they still drive like the place that they came from, not the context that they're in. And so it's one of those things that you just kind of keep an eye out for. We had one roadway in our data set that had a very low speed for the direction that all the tourists used. The opposite speed was used by locals, and it had a very high speed, actually higher than normal, because the populations were very different from each other. It took me almost a week to figure that out. The other thing is that if you've got a massive jam condition that's going on during the day, the speed formulas are going to predict a little bit higher than what you measure in terms of the 85th percentile speed. That's not because the speed formulas aren't showing you something real. It's because you've got all of this stuff down here that's skewing your 85th percentile speed too low. And so if you're going to capture what is an 85th percentile driver, the speed formula is going to predict what that 85th percentile driver is doing, not necessarily what is measured. When the congestion leaves, speeds go back up, and your pedestrian safety issues are not always going to happen when you've got a lot of congestion. People are driving slowly then, and so the pedestrians are probably safe then anyway. You really want to have this number, not the one in the blue. And that also brings up schools. I mentioned schools before, but schools really throw a monkey in the wrench. It's this disappearing speed control. So during the time that schools are actually in session, or where kids are actually arriving for those schools, you get a very, very heavy control on speed. Outside of those times, you get almost nothing. So for instance, this particular site has 3 different school time periods. And there's 3 different schools that are right around the block from this site. And you can literally see the difference between them and see how there's this little spot where it goes back to normal for just a few minutes. And then it goes high school, elementary school, and then middle school. And because the middle school isn't at the same time as the peak period of the roadway, the congestion isn't quite so bad. But those speed controls that you put in place for your school will get completely ignored the rest of the day. And that's normal. So when we created these equations, we had 2 main questions in the back of our head. Why are you trying to predict speed in the first place? And there's 2 main use cases. The first one is a single project or something that you're dreaming up. So you're in a public hearing and you have a roadway that's behaving a certain way now. You know what the features are for that roadway today, but you're proposing a really massive change. And you're expecting that that massive change is going to make a difference in the way that single corridor works. Well, in that case, those very complicated equations that have variables that are not easy to use in GIS are still very, very applicable. You can sit yourself down in Google Earth in that place and see exactly how many doorways there are. You can measure on Google Earth exactly how wide the corridor is, and you can tell from putting yourself there how wide the corridor looks, and use the benchmarks in the environment to measure how wide it looks. So that's great. And those non-GIS variables still work really well there. But if you wanted to go through and see something similar to a bicycle level traffic stress, which is what this is, if you wanted to see a pedestrian or a vulnerable user level of traffic stress that was tied into how fast the stream was going, you could actually use some of these scalable variables to predict how fast every road in the entire region is. See what your hotspots are. See how closely that actually aligns with the speed numbers you're measuring. All of those things are a completely different use case, but they're still critical. And so we created some formulas for those. The other question is whether or not you're looking at an entire corridor like you would use for probe speed data, where you've got 2 probes, 2 or 3 blocks apart, and you get the speed between the 2 probes that includes the intersection along the way. Or are you looking for a hotspot? What's happening at, say, a crosswalk? How fast are people actually going in that crosswalk? where you take your measurement makes a big difference. If you're looking for a corridor, then you take the average dimensions along that corridor. If you've got a hot spot, then you look at what's going on in that one spot. So that leads us to some thoughts on laying out your probes. So you're going to do a probe data collection to get the mid-block speed. There's always this question of how far apart should you put the probes? And this is my guidance, okay? So ideally, if you're trying to capture the speed at a mid-block, you want somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds of travel time. Anything shorter, and your numbers are going to be all over the place because you've got some people responding to some things and some people not, right? So the shorter your time slice is, the more likely you are to have aberrations in the behavior. The longer the slice is, the more it evens out what's going on. But then you can lose, or you can start to incorporate what's going on in the intersections, not necessarily what's at the mid-block. Ideally, you want to get a 4-second slice. So when you run the numbers, that basically means that you figure out what your typical speed's going to be in the corridor and multiply that by 6. So if I drive the corridor that I'm about to measure the speed on using a probe setup, and the typical speed on that corridor is about 35 miles an hour, do 6 times 35, that gives you a 210-foot spacing. So I put them, I'll put my probes 210 feet apart, but not at the intersections, so that I'm going to catch the middle of that block. So this new data set that we got from Virginia Tech that included, the entire speed along the segment, we had the same 85th percentile speed. We wanted to eliminate some of that jam condition kind of problem. And so we took about 15 to 16% of the data points out just to make sure we were dealing with a clean 85th percentile. The other ones, we weren't as concerned about being that careful. So we have 50th, 95th, and then the standard deviation. Now, you need to remember that each one of these numbers, the 85th percentile, the 50th, and the 95th, we're actually talking about an individual person. These are characteristics of the drivers that are in your traffic stream. A 95th percentile driver is a very aggressive driver who behaves very differently than your 50th percentile driver. And those characteristics tend to carry over from environment to environment. The standard deviation is also important. We're not going to talk about that today, but it is an important variable because the wider your standard deviation, the more conflict you're going to have in the vehicle stream. If you've got one guy that's going 45 and another one that's going 30, they're going to irritate each other, and that's going to cause vehicular crashes. So the narrower your standard deviation is, the less vehicular crashes you're going to have. Something to keep in the back of your mind. We also found that the behavior was very specific to the city. The drivers in Tampa are not the same drivers as the drivers in Seattle. And some of that has to do with the variables that you'll actually use in those cities. Today, it wasn't the case in 2011, but today Seattle basically has one speed limit for the entire city. So you wouldn't use posted speed limit in the formula because it's always posted the same. That actually wouldn't give you any results. So some of this is a mathematical artifact, but some of this is actually a behavioral artifact because people do drive differently in urban conditions when they're conditioned to be in an urban condition than when their normal situation is a suburban condition. That means that although we could create a generalized formula, and I think there actually is one out there, ultimately, these are going to end up being predicted city by city to capture what's going on in each individual city. And we're hoping to actually get involved. There is a project that should be coming out later this year that'll be proposing to do this kind of study. And we're hoping to be able to do that. But those are the kinds of things that are really important to understand. So we're going to talk about variables now, one by one. This is where the data gets hot and heavy. And first, we'll talk about the social measures. These are all about people and land use. So I'm going to tell you, I get questions all the time. How much does the speed limit matter? I'm going to tell you, it is absolutely, completely, totally critical. It does make a difference. It's just not a very big one. So the coefficient for this factor is about 0.25. The more variables you throw in, the lower it gets. The lowest coefficient I've seen is about 0.18. So for every 10 miles an hour that you change the speed limit sign, you'll get about a 2 mile an hour change in how fast people actually drive in the corridor. So do with that what you will. I would suggest that you need to change other things besides what's in the besides the sign, before you try to change the sign, because the sign isn't going to give you that much bang. Well, it gives you bang for the buck because it's really cheap to do that, but it's actually not going to change the behavior all that much. Doorway density does, though. So I wanted to give you a quick primer on how to actually measure this. To measure doorway density, you would actually count the number of active doors, not the ones that are painted black you use for emergency access, but the real doors on the corridor. Then you measure the block face width. That's the edge of the road to the edge of the road. And then divide the number of doors by the number of feet of block face in hundreds. So multiply by 100 if you have to. That just gets you to a nice round number. And we use that as a proxy for human activity. It does make a huge difference. You can see the R squared there is 0.326. This one pops up in almost every formula until we literally have to take it out, because it's not something that's easy to do in GIS. So, if you're going to do a scalable formula, you can't use this variable. But if you're not trying to do a scalable formula, it always makes a difference. Walk score. Now, walk score is almost GIS-able, almost. It's not guaranteed. The GIS you could get from walk score is not free. You can get the walk score at an individual location. And you can also get bands of 10. And let me show you how that works. Go to that page here. So on this page, this is walkscore.com, cities and neighborhoods. And this page shows you these little blocks here. So it lists the highest walk score cities that everyone is so proud of. And then it gives you these tiny little blocks over here. Now, if you click on these little blocks, Miami is number 6 and it's closest to me. So I'm going to click in here. That'll give you a page about Miami. Now, if you go into here, not this one. Oh, shoot. So if you go into this walk score map down here, not the top one, the bottom one, and you put that in full screen, you can actually move yourself around in here. And you can get basically any community in the whole US. So for instance, if I wanted to get my own community, I can go in here into Winter Garden, which is right there. And what it'll give you is a heat map. And that heat map has sections of 10. So each one of these color changes is 10 units in walk score. So if you wanted to get your walk score for any community, it's kind of cheating, but you can actually get it in bulk across your community and just use what you think, estimate it based on where it sits in these isobars. And go back to our presentation. We're going to resume. So it is more focused on land use mix in the area than an individual corridor. So it didn't often pop up as a variable that worked the best, but it did have a fairly large impact. As you can see, it's actually a little better than even the doorway density. Now, vulnerable user probability. We had data in our data set that showed us how often a vulnerable user was actually present at each site. And so we could measure the probability that you would see a vulnerable user in each location. And for every 10% increase in probability, the speed drops about 3 miles an hour. It's a pretty strong relationship. And they don't have to be seen every time to make a difference in the speed. We checked how often a vulnerable user was actually seen when they were present. And there were no times at which there was 100% of the time a person was actually there and they actually got seen every single time. So even if you have an environment where there's a vulnerable user there all the time, not every driver is going to see that there's a vulnerable user there. It doesn't have to be. Just because people regularly see them there, and if other people see them there, that still makes a difference in the speed. In our multimodal sample, we had about 13% of the drives that never had a pedestrian or cyclist there. So there are still places that are theoretically multimodal, but never actually get any people there. But there were also places where there were actually pedestrians and cyclists there, and nobody ever saw them in our entire sample. Now, those were often the places where they didn't expect to see them. So there were some as much as 60%, but usually they were in the lower range. So 10, 20, 30% probability that you'd see a pedestrian, and then the driver misses them completely. Now, that could be because the pedestrians are actually outside of the driver's view shed. There are a dozen different reasons why this might happen. And you would think that this was not a variable you could actually use in real life. But that's not true. So if you've got land use that's changing, you can use a land use model and project how likely it is you'd have a pedestrian there. Those models are complicated and you may not be able to use them, but they do exist. And it's probably a good idea for people to begin to create them. You could guess at it based on previous experience. But if the only thing that's changing is the road, if you're not actually changing the land use, you could use the pedestrian counts that you count now and see how the probability is today and use that in a formula. That's one way to do it. Another way is to measure it historically using Google Maps. So Google Maps will show you a picture. You put yourself down in Street View. This is not Google Earth. This is just Google Maps. And you can actually look at a historical timeline of all of the pictures they've taken in that place. You can use that. They're basically random time slices. You can use that to look around in each of those places and determine whether or not you saw a pedestrian at that location. You count the number of time slices you have and the number of times that you actually saw a person, and that'll give you a rough estimate of the probability of seeing a pedestrian in that location. So this is actually a metric you could use in real life. Now, quick aside, in terms of peds and bike presence, this is a completely different question. What is it that would actually draw a pedestrian or cyclist to that environment? Well, first of all, if you're in an urban environment, you got a 10% better chance of seeing a pedestrian at any one location than if you're in a suburban environment. So that's just right off the top of the bat. And that's not just seeing, that's just presence, whether they would even be there. If your stop or signal spacing is really tight, you've got a higher chance. We usually put sidewalks where we expect to see people, but that's not a guarantee. Remember, when your metric becomes your measure, your metric no longer works. So this is a bit of a feedback relationship. Take it with a grain of salt. Doorway density, the land use density, and when there's really low speeds, those are the things that will actually make it conducive for a pedestrian or cyclist to be there. Now, what is it that would keep them from being seen if they were there? And that's a completely different question. So remember, in the last slide, or 2 slides ago, we talked about whether they were actually seen if they were there. Well, so in terms of that, if your right-of-way width is really, really wide, even if a pedestrian is there, they may not get seen. If you've got a lot of lanes or your sidewalks are pushed way back away from the roadway, there may be good reasons to do that, but your vehicle flow isn't going to get as impacted because you're not going to see the pedestrians even when they're there. And the other thing is speed. So the faster drivers are moving, the less likely it is that they're going to see pedestrians even if they are there. So that was our quick aside. We'll go back to speed. So corridor width, remember, we're talking about what tunnel am I moving through, and can I see anyone close enough to the vehicle to actually care that they're there? So again, we talked about earlier, the width at eye height really was the variable that made the biggest difference. If I didn't take this variable out, it was always the very first one to get chosen by the algorithms. It's the one that's the most stable. It's also the hardest one to measure. So this one gave us the most accuracy. And at the moment, it's not scalable. We're going to try to figure out how we could actually make it scalable by using computer vision. But right now, it's really difficult to actually do that with anything other than human eyes. And even with human eyes, it's not easy to measure well, especially in suburban areas. We started out thinking about this as the width of a driver's eye height. And let me show you how difficult this can get. We'll give you an easy one first. So this is a corridor that has a very uniform width at eye height. So if you go from tree to tree, that's really the tunnel you're looking at. And you can see the sight lines as you're driving down the road. So very simple, somewhere between 38 and 40 feet or so, right? It depends on whether you measure from the center of the tree to the edge of the tree. It's probably closer to 38, right? How about two not so easy examples? So this first one, not so bad. You've got fences here, but you've got some trees that are beginning to invade that space. So, if we just call it where the fences are, we'll call that 80 feet, right? How about this other one? We can see this fence on the one side, but on the other side, there's an open field and it's not as consistent, the distance to the obstacles on the side of the road aren't as consistent. So is it back where this back tree is, or is it up where this main pole is? Is it down here where it gets a little more consistent? 125 feet, maybe? Here's the problem. Those two pictures are actually the same location, just looking in different directions. It turns out when you're looking at the overall corridor, those open spots, they make a difference. And remember, as you're driving down the corridor, speed goes up and down. It's not exactly the same speed for the entire length. And so as you're going through a tighter space, you might drive just a little more slowly. And when it opens up temporarily for just a little bit, you might speed up just a smidge, but you've got an intersection here, so you might not. And an occasional open space in the corridor doesn't make a big difference in terms of the driver's behavior. It does make a big difference in terms of whether or not people are there, though. It trashes your walkability badly. So you got this big open space and no sidewalk. And, how is a pedestrian going to actually navigate from here to there? So these missing teeth, and that's what urban designers call them, can make a really big difference in the way drivers behave, or in the way pedestrians see the environment. It doesn't tend to make as big a difference in the way drivers see the environment, as long as it's not this long expanse of a wide open area. Building to building face is another variable that we measured. You could do this in GIS. It's not simple. It could take an awful lot of coding to be able to do this, but it's a lot less predictable in terms of prediction for speed, the wider that distance gets. At some point, you quit seeing how wide it is. It's just open. But it is a policy lever. So if your setbacks are really, really wide, you just about guaranteed you're going to get really high speeds on your roadway. So fighting for a smaller setback in your development regulations is fighting for a lower speed on your roadway. The closer the buildings are to the road, the slower people are going to drive on that road. Number of lanes. Now, as you can see, this is not a super, super strong change. However, when we put these in the formula, it did actually give us a really big jump in the accuracy. So even though it doesn't look like a big change from one directional lane to two, so from a 2-lane road to a 4-lane road, it actually does give you a big change in driver behavior. And so when we use this in the formula, it actually worked better than a lot of other variables that look like they had a better correlation. And by the way, it works better logarithmic than straight. Lane width. Now, this one was a head scratcher because, first of all, a 25-foot wide lane, that doesn't make any sense. And second of all, it's going in the wrong direction. People are going slower with the wider lane than they are with the narrower lane. And it turns out that Seattle was what was kind of throwing this off. It's not that this didn't happen in Tampa, it did. But this is an old historical way of designing streets. We'll talk about in a minute. It's called wide outside lanes. And so they would make the outside lane really wide to accommodate things like on-street parking or bike lanes. And in those locations where on-street parking was actually happening or where bike lanes were actually happening, you got a pretty big decrease in speed. Okay, but how often does that happen today? It actually doesn't happen that often anymore. So let me show you some examples. So this is a 24-foot wide striped lane, but drivers are really only using 12 feet of it. Here's a 21-foot wide lane that they're only using 10 feet of. This is 13 feet on each side, but they're only using 15 feet in the middle. So basically 7.5 feet apiece. It's really operating as a yield street. Here's another one. This was really interesting. In Seattle, if you put the Sharrow off to the side, they would actually not drive where that Sharrow was. I saw places like that in Tampa where they put the Sharrow off to the side. They still took the whole lane because there aren't enough bicyclists for them to be concerned with. And so, a lot has to do with how your drivers are behaving. We created a variable called functional lane width. And we used it only in the places where we could actually see that there was definitely a difference between where drivers were placing their vehicle and where the roadway actually lands. And this is actually a picture of those old wide outside lanes. Now, I'm going to give you a side trip on this. John Forrester was a bicycling advocate in the 70s and 80s. And he created an entire training program that would train a cyclist to drive in traffic, not ride like a cyclist, like a bicycle rider. So you would have a driver on a bicycle rather than a person on a bicyclist or a person on a bicycle riding. There's a big difference between the two. Now, the Forrester absolutely hated on-street bike lanes and side paths because the people that he trained to cycle were going 20 to 25 miles an hour. And when you're going that fast and you come up against somebody who's going a lot slower, you don't have time to react to that. And you'll end up cartwheeling over top of your new little obstacle. Not good for the obstacle, not good for the cyclist. So we quit doing those kinds of things very, very early on, sometime in the 80s or so. We quit doing these wide outside lanes by the 90s, but they still exist out there. And when you take into account where the driver is actually placing their vehicle, the curve now goes in the right direction. Doesn't go solidly in the right direction, but now, as the lanes get wider, we actually see people going faster, which is what we recognize happens in real life. Now, I'll tell you, suburban drivers usually use every inch that you give them and a little more. So once you get to about 11 feet, the driver in suburban or urban environments, they're taking the whole lane. But so if you're narrower than 12 feet or 11 feet in your striping, they're taking the whole lane. But suburban drivers tend to take the whole lane regardless. They're just all over the place. They really don't put themselves in one unique spot. Center width. So the width of the median or the striping. So that had a very strong correlation. Remember, we looked at Pioneer Square a little bit ago. It was a very tight urban environment that had the median down the middle. In an environment where you've got a lot of doors and a lot of other things going on, you're still going to get a very low speed, even though you've got a fairly wide median. But you can see the wider your median goes, the faster the speed's going to be. And as you add in striping, like a double line, that's going to increase your speed slightly too. You can see that where there was a double line, you got a slightly higher speed, not by much, but it is real, than if it's just, a skip stripe or no striping at all. Sidewalk width. Obviously, we put sidewalks where people are likely to be. And so this correlation goes both directions. Past about 15 feet, there's not as strong a correlation. In terms of longitudinal measures, we're talking here about the interaction of time and space. So how does the corridor present itself to the driver as the driver is moving along in time? Block length was the measure that made the biggest difference. And you can measure block length two different ways. You can look at the blocks that are just on the right side of the road, or you could look at it in terms of the conflicts that the driver is going to see from either side. Well, it turns out that the right side had a better R squared in the formulas, but when we used them in the testing, both directions actually worked better in our back-end testing. I tend to like bidirectional, counting what the potential conflicts are more than just counting what's on the right side of the road, at least for block length. In driveway spacing, it probably works the opposite way, but in block length, you probably need to think about what conflicts is the driver actually getting to. Some of the things that we saw in the testing were that most signalized driveways do actually act like a side street, unless it's a signal for a school, and then people ignore it entirely. A lot of the firehouse signals get ignored too, because they're just not activated often enough for a driver to worry about whether or not they're there. That's why you do the extra signaling in advance of those firehouse signals, because people will blow right through them. They're not used to actually seeing them activated. Any major interruption in the street's flow can also act a little bit like a side street. One site that had a very long straight roadway and then a jog, and that jog pushed the street off by about 2 street widths. So it was a strong enough jog that you couldn't see down the street any longer. And it turns out that when we use the formulas there, if I called that a break in the block length, the formulas perform so much better than if I just used the actual distance from block face to block face. So we're getting kind of this visual interruption that drivers are actually seeing as an interruption. Go figure. Uninterrupted length, we measured the uninterrupted length. That would be the distance between a hard stop, like a stop sign or a signal. So again, pedestrian and school signals didn't matter, but it gave us a really good R squared, and it worked great in the formulas if you were just looking at our data set. It didn't work so great when we were actually testing it in our count samples. So part of that is because some of our count samples were extraordinarily long. So it had very, very long distance between stops or signals. And we think that the effect kind of evaporates somewhere between a half a mile and a third a mile. So you see how this is a very tight cluster with the exponential when it's low, and it kind of begins to spread as you get past about a half a mile. So if that signal only gets activated a few times a day, it probably actually isn't an interruption. Driveway spacing. Again, we measured that 2 different ways. Are we looking at the conflicts that are coming from both sides, or are we looking at just the conflicts on the right side? And for driveway spacing, the right side actually worked just a little bit better. Sight distance. Now we're going to talk about the socks, Barbara. Socks matter. So this has to do with how far ahead we can see. We know that drivers compensate for the uncertainty if the block length is short enough. So if you were to think about the maximum sight distance that we've ever measured for a vulnerable user is about 1,000 feet. And that came out of a study where they actually had people on bicycles sitting in a roadway, and they had people drive up to the cycles, and they didn't know that they were going to see them. And the driver in the study, or the researcher in the study, asked them to tell the researcher when they actually saw the cyclist. The farthest distance they could see regularly was about 1,000 feet, 300 meters. And that only happened when the cyclist was wearing striped socks. So that biological movement of their feet, Barbara, is absolutely critical but it really makes a big difference on whether or not you can actually see those feet moving. If they're black and the environment behind it is black, you're not going to see them. If they've got stripes, they're clear as day. So if we start with 1,000 feet is the maximum, you lose about a mile an hour for every 1,000 feet that sight distance comes close to you. So if you've got 500 feet of sight distance, you're losing about 6 miles an hour. If you only have 300 feet of sight distance, you're probably losing about 8, which is kind of cool. Curve radius. We didn't have enough data points in our sample to be able to use this in our prediction equations. But this is a very, very old relationship. And as you can see, up to about 1,000 feet of curb radius, the effect is very strong. And our best estimate based on the research that I've read so far is about a mile an hour for every degree of curvature for a radius between 200 feet of radius and 1,000 feet of radius. You could use that to estimate how much your chicane is actually going to impact your speed. I don't have enough statistical strength to put it in my formulas, but it's one of those things that from a physics standpoint, we know the mechanics, we know it's going to work, so you can stick that in the back of your head. Now, again, I want to remind you that there are people behind all of these. So every single variable that we've been talking about, people really are foundational to that variable. We change and we make a lower posted speed if we think that there are going to be people there. That visual width of the corridor is all about whether or not there's going to be people enough in the space for me to see them. In a small enough space, I can actually physically see them. Interruptions are often because of people or other vehicles. So those are also really people oriented. And an urban environment is going to have more people in that environment. So every single one of these variables has their own unique impact on the way speed operates, but they all come back to people. So we tested 3 different equation types. There's a kitchen sink model where you just build as big a model as you can that makes sense and see what matters. And a lot of times you come up with some really interesting things. If I left things like the visual corridor width or the doorway density in those models as I built up the model, they always popped up first and they always stayed in the models the longest. A scalable model is where we took out the variables that we knew you couldn't use in GIS. And so if you've got only GIS ready variables, what kind of formula can you get? They're not going to be quite as accurate, but they do still work. And then of course, you want to have a back of the envelope projection. So something that's simple enough that if you're standing in a public hearing and you need to give a number off the cuff to a politician, you need to have a number you can give them. That's what those equations, that we tried to create equations that would actually work that way. So trade-offs, as we were creating all of these equations, and I've done literally hundreds of them now, so I kind of know how the variables interact. In terms of the human presence, vulnerable user probability works the best. And that's good news for me because we really do believe that the likelihood of having a person there is the biggest impact on the way people drive. It's also the hardest thing to measure. So since that's hard to measure, doorway density is a little easier to measure and it gives good results. Not quite as good as probability, but it'll work. Walk score doesn't change speed as often as we would like it to because it captures the land use mix, but not specifically what's going on in that individual corridor. It does actually matter sometimes, but not nearly as often. It's quite rare that it does. In terms of other trade-offs, the visual width takes up an awful lot of space in that equation. So that little visual tunnel that people are driving down accounts for a lot of other things. And so if I have to take that out of the equation, I have to replace it with multiple variables, things like the number of lanes and the width between the buildings, the area in the center, the sidewalk width. All of those things are replacements for what is the real variable, how wide the corridor looks. You could trade out vulnerable user probability for sidewalk width sometimes. You put wide sidewalks where in the places you expect to see people. but you need to think through how well those sidewalks are actually being used. If you just throw a sidewalk in that's really wide, willy-nilly for no reason, and you don't have people there, that relationship isn't going to be as solid. So each of these formulas has this layout. You have a constant and then a sum of a variable quantity and a constant that goes with that variable. So for instance, in the generalizable equation, we have 1.6 is, or 5.6 is the constant, 5.26. How did that get changed? Anyway, no, down here, this best general one. So you have the constant here is negative 1.6. And then you would take 1.68 and multiply it by the doorway density and subtract that from the 1.6 you started with. And then you'd take 8.38 times the log of the visual width, natural log, not log base 10, natural log of the visual width, add that in. Then 0.0057 times the block length. You see the block length down here. And then 0.053 times the site distance. You can take a picture of this. I haven't published this in a journal yet, but I'm going to include this in the report for FDOT. These are all good prediction formulas for that 85th percentile speed. That original formula works best for mid-block conditions. These other ones are created using those segment level predictions. So they're going to work a little better with like probe data and trying to correlate or predict your probe data. And again, we have a series of formulas. The best general is actually similar to the original formula. We just added in the site distance. It does actually make enough difference to give you about a half a mile an hour overall. The best scalable formula is here. We had completely different formulas for Seattle and Tampa, but the Tampa one is not scalable, the best Tampa one. And you can see we can get down to about 3.5 miles an hour in the data set. Again, when we tested this in terms of a completely different community, the answers were never quite as perfect, but we tried to use variables in these formulas that transferred well. There's another scalable Tampa formula there too. We had a series of equations that we created for the 50th percentile. This is your everyday driver. And those were simple enough, both 50th and 95th percentile, that we could actually do just a change in the constant between an urban and a suburban environment. Posted speed matters in both of those. Again, it doesn't make a big difference, but it does matter. And you look and you see that equation constant here, that's telling you that for your back of the envelope equation, it's working really, really well. And you're only getting about 1.6 miles an hour change for every 10 mile an hour that you change the sign in the 50th percentile speed. The 50th percentile speed stays very stable. It doesn't move around a lot. So changing your sign doesn't change your 50th percentile. It does change your 95th and your 85th percentile speed. So there may be good reasons to do that just to get the top speeds down, but it's not going to change the overall speed of the flow. That visual tunnel, the width at eye height is here. You'd see that still makes a big difference, and not a big difference between 50th and 95th. The log of the lanes, the number of lanes makes a much bigger difference to that fast driver, the aggressive driver, than it does the average driver. Sidewalk width, they're both paying attention to it, but the 50th percentile driver is paying more attention to it than the aggressive driver. It's an interesting finding. The center width matters more to the aggressive driver. So when he's got a big median, he's out of here. He's going to be much higher in speed. And that uninterrupted length matters more to the 50th percentile driver than 95th. The 95th percentile driver is probably going to speed up so quickly. He's seeing things as a steady state continuous much earlier than the 50th percentile driver is seeing it. Accuracy, we're in about the same range for each of them. So all of them are usable. And we're going to take another Mentimeter break. I know that was a long section and PJ's got all kinds of questions. So we'll start with the question in it. Let's get you first to the Mentimeter questions. So you can start working on those because they're pretty darn cool. Not that. Sorry. Apologies. Alt tab. We're going to here. So their sight distance did matter. Remember, you originally said the majority of people said that sight distance would make the biggest difference. It does make a difference. Remember, we're looking at about 3 miles an hour per, or no, 1 mile an hour per every 100 feet that you lose from over 1,000. But the corridor width was actually the variable that made the biggest difference. So next question. If you're trying to manage speed without changing the speed limit sign, what can you do? Block length, yes. Adding more side streets. Let's look at the Q&A while we're seeing those pop up. And an indication of, oh, Barb's talking about what we implicitly pay attention to. Well, okay, yeah, you're right. Barb is saying we implicitly think of slowing down for a school crosswalk as congestion. These are actually not, the place that I was showing you was actually not right there next to the school. That was literally backups in the traffic from people going to school. So it's not necessarily the same thing, but you're right. It is an interesting conceptual way of looking at things. And the closeness of the doors to the roadway does actually matter. If you've got a big parking lot, those doors don't count at all. So if you've got like 1 row of parking and a drive lane, you could probably count those. But short of that, short of like the 1 row and a drive lane, those driveways don't matter anymore because the drivers it's not close enough for the drivers to actually see the pedestrians coming in out of the road. So if you've got a parking lot, your doorway density is probably going to be 0. Okay. So you do treat a corridor that has a massive parking lot as if it has no doors at all, because it's functioning as if it has no doors at all. Bigger signs. Seattle put in more and bigger signs when they lowered the speed limit citywide. And some of the results go to that. I didn't look at speed limit spacing and size, but it's an interesting variable. Yeah, we mind wandering tourists do need reminders. Suburbanites don't care. They just don't. None of my non-engineer friends know what a SHRP2 symbol means. That's funny. And that's absolutely true. The destructive John Forrester legacy. Oh, yes, that's very interesting. I honestly believe that one of the biggest barriers to cycling as a functional part of our everyday life is the cycling lobby. And that's a hard pill to swallow because those are our friends. Those are the people that have actually been pushing us towards thinking about cycling at all in the first place. And I don't want to be ungrateful to the contributions that they have given. But cycling in the roadway for 80 to 90% of the cyclists that are likely to be using cycling is dangerous. So if we're thinking that the interested, anything but the experienced need something other than a roadway feature, a bike lane in the roadway, we've eliminated 80% of our possible market share. So, oh, interesting. Who was that? Barb?
Nathan has their hand up.
Let's see. How could I? Yes, please. Can you do that? Nathan, if you would unmute, we should be able to hear you. You there, Nathan? Oh, he put his hand down. Okay. Eye height from sedan or SUV. What we're really looking for is the visual tunnel width, the width of the visual tunnel that the driver is driving through. Eye height, I was thinking in terms of 3.5 feet off the ground, which is more sedan than SUV, but there might be a slight difference between the two. Next question. If we're evaluating sidewalks near the curb or at outer limits of the right of way, which people with a people effect? Okay, we're going to talk about this in the next section. So in terms of what's going to change the way people drive, having a sidewalk close to the roadway is going to make a bigger difference in how people actually drive. But that's not the only question to be answered. And that's going to be something we talk about in the policy stuff. Hold on, we'll come back to it. How do you measure doorway density with multi-lane state roads and shopping plazas? Like I said earlier, if there's a parking lot short of, one line of parking, if you've got any more than one line of parking, that doorway density is 0, because those doorways do not impact that corridor at all. Okay. Having trouble reading the table, what's the one to get 95th percent speeds down? You said first. So the 95th percentile speeds is the table that says 95th percentile speeds. So the first table I showed was all 85th percentile. And then I showed another slide that had 50th and 95th. So the variables that are going to impact the 95th percentile speeds are the ones that are on that 95th table. And I'm hoping you took a screenshot of that. I can come back to it at the end and pop it back up. What is the negative 20? Okay, so in those equations, there's always a constant, and that's just to calibrate where the equation sits, or where the outside variables sit. So I gave you an example of how to actually read those tables and use those variables. You multiply the variable times the constant in that column to get that value. So we can go back to that at the end if we need to, okay? If we have a right of way, is bike ped trails preferable to bike lanes and sidewalks? We're going to answer that in the next section. Does a mid-block pedestrian crossing count for reducing the block length? Depends on how often it's used. If it's never used, no. If it's used regularly and it has a speed table or something that indicates to the driver it's going to be used regularly, it might. Okay, but that's a very qualified maybe. If people generally slowed down and drove carefully to compensate for the presence of people, we wouldn't have concentrated hotspots of pedestrian crashes. So what might your research lead you to hypothesize is behind those pedestrian crash hotspots? Often, those hotspots are occurring in 2 places, one of which is a transition zone. So any place where you're transitioning from one type of environment to another, you're much more likely to have a mismatch between the expectations of the pedestrian and the cyclist, or the pedestrian and the driver. The other issue is that hotspots are often in places that are dark, because a lot of our pedestrian and bike fatalities have less to do with whether or not they can be seen during the daytime than whether or not they can be seen at night. And that's a whole avenue we have yet to even begin to explore well. That makes sense? So this may help going back an example. Labeling on the cell. Okay. All right. That's in that question. Okay. So if we need to go back to that, we will. Let's look at some of these Mentimeter answers. So if you were trying to manage speed without changing the speed limit signs, by the way, we actually are using this as a survey. We're going to send back these results to FDOT. So physical channelization, decrease the corridor width. I think decreasing the corridor width makes the biggest sense. It really does help the most. Bulb outs really make a big difference. Ah, shoot. My finger keeps sending us to the wrong place. Raised intersections and landscaping. The raised intersections really do make a big difference. Be careful with the medians, because adding those medians adds extra width. The other issue is that frequently adding a bike lane, especially if that bike lane is not going to get used, will increase the speed of your corridor. Not if you haven't moved the curb width, it won't matter as much. But just adding in a bike lane, if you add the extra width for the bike lane, you may end up getting a faster speed than you want. Planting trees next to the curb line makes a big difference. Reducing lane widths and number of lanes, narrowing the roadway, decreasing the width. All right, we're going to go on the next question, our survey question. So this is actually an opinion question. I want your opinion. Everybody has rules in the back of their head for setting what the speed limit sign should say. Okay. And I want you, not what your rule is locally, but what you personally think makes the most sense. If you had to pick a rule for how you were going to set the speed limit for a corridor, what rule would you use?
There are 3 questions on that.
Okay, and we'll come back to this in a second while y'all are answering that. So how does the condition, we got to that one. Press enter, okay. If sight distance is number 1, it's not, by the way. Why do drivers corner so aggressively? Because it's fun. Duh. Both sight distance and curve, the radius of the curve have a physical impact on the speed that a driver can comfortably use. But we're talking about what a driver will comfortably use, not what a driver will actually enjoy being thrilled by. And so even though sight distance and the radius of a curve make a difference in the bulk, there are some people who are actually going to take those curves faster because they like to. Not always a good thing, but it does happen. Enter. So what width of eye height being with width of eye height being impactful, how much of a role do you think vehicle height and type plays? It's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know that it's that big of a difference from, say, going from a Corvette to an SUV. You know, so if you're going from a Hummer to a Corvette, there might be a difference because there is a huge difference between the two. But I don't know that there's a big difference in terms of how high the driver actually is sitting. There might be. I don't know that there's not, but I suspect there's not. Just because what we're really trying to see in terms of that visual width of the corridor is the tunnel that the driver is driving through. And so if that tunnel looked bigger because you were down in a Corvette, then maybe that Corvette might go a little faster than the Hummer who's up high and the tunnel doesn't look as big because he's a bit higher. That would be hard to say though. And I suspect it's such a small difference, it wouldn't make that big of a difference. There's a parallax effect that really does affect speed. We didn't measure that in this particular study, but I've seen studies that look at how parallax impacts speed, and it's not a negligible effect. It does actually matter. And PJ may have one more. Ooh, so target speed. So the community decides what the target speed is going to be, and you try to set the speed limit right there. Okay, but between 50 and the 85th, that makes sense. 85th percentile. A lot of engineers, and then there's some people along the others. A lot of engineers that are kind of split on this. Nobody decided to get out on push. You know, we made people stop entirely and get out and push. Anyway, so that's an interesting observation that as a group we're still thinking that the target speed is the goal. I have mixed feelings about that. I think it may actually, one of the things that Dwayne talks about in the FDM is that often a community will have a target speed, but it may take several steps of changes in that corridor to actually be able to lower the speed limit to the target speed. And so I want it to get to the target speed. I don't know that you can get there in one step every single time. And the last question is an anticipation of the next section. So based on what you've seen so far, what policy or design changes would you like to see happen? And we've got some questions floating around here. An unused bike lane equals an extra wide shoulder equals increased speed? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that happens a lot. From my experience, I tend to drive way faster on the interstate in my 3500 in my Chevy when driving the Vet. It feels faster when you're lower. Okay, that's fair. Statutory speed limit was not an option. Huh. Well, okay, statutory speed limit does actually, it's a different strategy. If you have a single speed limit for the entire community, you start there as elected officials choose it. That's an interesting strategy. I will add that to the list directly to make sure that we have that included in our results. And no more 6-lane arterials. Well, that might work, maybe. We'll talk about that in a minute. Variable speed limit suggestions into a connected vehicle dashboard. Okay, interesting. No two-way left turn lanes. I really don't like two-way left turn lanes, but the median doesn't seem to help all that much. Human scale design rather than vehicle scale. The end of toll lanes. What's the purpose? Well, I think there's a place for them, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's part of why I wanted this question, because I wanted you to think about where does this actually matter? So we have separated and ped bike facilities. Ah, shoot. I hate it when it does that. Oops. Nope. Go back. More lane repurposing. I think more lane repurposing would really help. Got some questions down here. With it being so, we answered this one. Okay, so what's the impact of a truly protected bike lane on speed? I don't know yet. And I think a lot of that has to do with your block length and how you're actually integrating those protected bike lanes into the intersections themselves. So often you'll put a truly protected bike lane, a side path, and let's make a distinction between a side path and a shared use path. A side path is still going to have an impact because they're still within the visual range of the driver. And you still have to manage those bicycles in the intersections. And so depending on how you actually manage the bicycles in the intersections, I think having bicycles in a truly protected bike lane as a side path is still going to make a big difference in the speed of the flow. Okay. However, if you're talking about a shared use or a shared use path, a multi-use path, a shared path that is outside of the corridor or away from the roadway, I think from what I'm seeing in the research, that's going to have either no impact on speed or the speed's actually going to be a little bit higher. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing. So it is an issue, but it may not be a big issue. And we'll talk about that next. Engineers designing the roadway to the target speed, not for higher speeds. I think that's the biggest change we need to have, that the community should be the one that decides how fast that roadway needs to go. But part of that community decides issue is a question of reality. So is it realistic to take a corridor that will never have any people on it at all, ever? Is it realistic to post that corridor at an artificially low speed because they want to feel like they are walkable, but their land use actually doesn't give anyone anywhere to go? I think it's a valid policy question. Do we actually make drivers go a lot slower than they normally would when no one's ever going to be there? It's a very important question. And the clear zone concept probably does need some reform. We need a layman's document for summarizing the research to avoid the continuous requests to just lower their speeds. Well, there are times it's appropriate to just lower the speed. There are going to be plenty of times it's not. And that brings us to our next section. I hope everybody's ready. What do you think, PJ? You think we're ready? He says we go. So we're going to talk about policy now. So what do we do about this? What are the implications? Well, first of all, we're not blaming anybody. You do the best with what you know, and we'll do better because we know better now, right? We can't go back in time and change the things that have happened before. We can change what we do now. The other caveat is that I'm going to tell you what I think is appropriate guidance based on the research that we have seen. These are principles, not a prescription. And it is not FDOT's policy. You don't have to do this. There are no regulations that say you have to do what I say to do. But I do want you to think about them in the back of your head as you're designing the areas that you're designing. Design evolves over time. I just spent a week or two going through the plans and preparation manual for Florida and then the FDM and the current Green Book. And there have been massive changes. We went from on-street parking lanes that we allocate 10 feet to for an 8-foot lane, which actually looks kind of like what we do now, but assuming that they would be there, not assuming that they wouldn't be there in the 60s, to 1985, where we have those funky wide outside lanes. And then we get into 1998. We don't have the wide outside lanes anymore. Now we have bike lanes and multi-purpose paths. And we'd gone to metric for a very short period of time. We were doing 4-foot bike lanes and 5-foot bike lanes in rural places. So, very vestigial kinds of bike lanes. And we moved away from that. So by now, the 2023 Green Book, we're looking at a 7-foot buffered bike lane with, a very clear double stripe line saying absolutely cars do not belong in this place. We use green paint where we can in the transition spaces. And we're taking into account where we're going to put our side paths or our multi-use paths, how they actually interact in the intersections. Do we put them out at a mid-block away from the intersection, or do we put them right next to it and try to make sure that they're a part of the intersection, but not in these funky places where they're going to get run over by right turning traffic? But the research basically indicates there's really 2 approaches to managing our drivers. We can use a brute force approach, or we can shape their behavior. Brute force uses the laws of physics. Shaping uses all of the social and psychological principles we've talked about. Brute force is always in the roadway, but shaping takes into account everything that's around the driver. Brute force is a very spot-specific kind of treatment. It works where it works and nowhere else. When you're shaping the environment and shaping the driver's behavior, everything in the environment speaks, but also it speaks for the length of the roadway. It's not just the one spot. You get an impact over the length of the road. Brute force is also usually very speed specific. It doesn't change the way people pay attention. It doesn't change how cautious they are. They slow down for the speed table you gave them, and then they speed up in between, and they're not paying attention in either place. They're trying to make sure they don't ruin their suspension. They don't care what's happening on the side of the road. Shaping gives you a speed control, but it also changes the driver's attention and awareness, the focus they have looking for vulnerable users. When you use a brute force approach, there are almost always negative consequences. When you force somebody to do something, you're going to end up with them pushing back. Not only will they adjust for their speed in between those treatments, but it's going to change your emergency response time. There was a study in Seattle that showed you're losing as much as 6 seconds for every single speed table. And if you have to space them at 350 feet apart and you have 10 of them, you've now lost 60 seconds on your response time. That's a huge loss. On the other hand, when you're shaping that environment based on the context, you get some secondary benefits. And this is where those benefits come in. I never dreamed that real functional mode shift could be possible in a suburban community. And my community is about as suburban as you can get. But about 16 years ago, we did a massive streetscape in our downtown, and we added in a whole bunch of infrastructure that really helps bicyclists and pedestrians interact in a very safe way. We added a bunch of parking. We made it legal for golf carts to be in the mix. The land use mix is really very fine scaled. It's only about 3/4 of a mile from my house to this area. And what happened is that people have begun to use it. Now, this quantity of bicyclists was probably a year or two ago. That's ordinary for a Saturday now. This cycle bus is basically a cargo bus that you use for your children. That happened last week. This was actually right before church on Wednesday night. And one of the moms brought their kids to church from their home in her brand new bike bus. That's a functional use for very vulnerable users, not just cyclists, kids. And when you begin to see this happening in the environment, that means it's going to happen with kids biking themselves. And you can use multiple modes as successful modes of travel in the entire community. You've actually seen a mode shift away from real cars into those bikes. Now, I still drove there, but that doesn't mean I'm not looking at a cargo bike. My kids aren't that small anymore. So the biggest design implication is that you can design a roadway based on physics, but street design has to be grounded in social psychology. And when you're looking at a street road hybrid, that's not working for anybody. The pedestrians and cyclists aren't safe, and they know it, and so hopefully they stay away. And the drivers don't expect to see pedestrians, so when there is one, they're likely to hit them. You have to pick one or the other. That requires a strategic shift in our controlling conditions. When you're thinking about a roadway, the inertia of the vehicle still matters, and it's still going to be the critical factor. But an urban driver is going to choose their speed and behavior based on the risks that they believe are probable in that situation. So if they don't believe they're going to interact with a pedestrian or cyclist in that space because they can't see them, because they're too far away, because they've never seen them there before, they are not going to respond. So they're not going to slow down. They're not going to be looking for pedestrians, and they're not going to be safe. So you need to pick one or the other. I went through the standards with this in mind and basically came back with this as our guidance. You can have a pedestrian integrated design where you integrate pedestrians and bikes into the corridor successfully. Or you can have a separated design where you separate those pedestrians and cyclists outside of that corridor and give them buffering and protection. But you can't do both in the same space. And the logic behind this is that if I can't guarantee that the drivers expect to see pedestrians, I can't guarantee they're going to change their behavior, and whoever's in that space is not going to be safe. So that puts you on a continuum between an integrated space and a separated space. So if you have a roadway, which is a separated space, a clear zone strategy makes a lot of sense there. You're going so fast that if the flows are going so fast that if a driver hits an obstacle, the driver might die. You're also going so fast that if the driver hits a pedestrian, the pedestrian absolutely will die. The chances of a pedestrian surviving at 40 miles an hour are 50-50. So anything above 40 miles an hour, and most of the pedestrians that get hit are going to die from that. And a serious or fatal or a serious injury is, you're looking at 75% at 40 miles an hour. That's a pretty serious break point. You really don't want to have vulnerable users in that space. And so you need to be very overt about pulling them out of that space and giving them a safe space to be. If you're at a street, the chances of actually having a vulnerable user in trouble, if there is a crash, and the likelihood of a crash is much lower, if there is a crash, they're a lot more likely to walk away from it. and they're an awful lot more likely to be seen at that speed. So if you've got a corridor that's getting a speed below 20 to 25 miles an hour, if your operating speed is that low, it's probably because your corridor is really tight, which means that the drivers are really able to see what people are doing, and they're slow enough to respond when they see them. So it's perfectly fine to integrate pedestrians and bicyclists into those areas. These are places where jaywalking works fine. You could do street play with basketballs in a local neighborhood and everything's okay. No harm, no foul, right? In between, you got a problem. People are going too fast to actually see the pedestrians in the road. And the pedestrians in the road are likely to get very seriously injured. And they might think it's safe when it really isn't. And so the strategy there is to decide which direction you're going to send that problem. Are you going to call it a road or are you going to call it a street? If you're going to call it a street, you need to figure out how to slow everybody down. If you're going to call it a road, you need to figure out how to get your pedestrians and cyclists somewhere else. Two completely different strategies. You just need to pick one. So for an integrated design, pedestrians and bicyclists are safe to integrate in the street, but the visual presentation of the roadway is very critical. You want tight corridors and every single detail is going to matter. You want vertical things very close to the traffic. And I don't care if they're breakaway, because I don't want anybody hitting the pedestrians who are going to be on the side of the street. The key factor is, though, that if there is not regular human activity there, the behavior is not going to change for the drivers. They won't slow down unless they actually see people there regularly. So the strategy involves making sure that your land use is appropriate to that. You're actually going to have people there regularly. Doesn't have to be all the time, but it does have to be consistent. Use a lateral offset strategy. So no breakaway, but you can put things as close as you want to the roadway. Now, I'm going to take a quick side trip in terms of access management. And this is speed management 202. So if you are trying to keep your speeds down, is access management your friend or your enemy? Well, every time you shut off a block with your access management strategy, you double your block length. When you double your block length, drivers are going to go a lot faster. So going from something like a Florida class 3 access management to class 5 changes your speed somewhere between 3 and 5 miles an hour. If you're going from class 5, if you've got a 660-foot spacing and you go to a half-mile spacing like you'd see in a class 3 or class 2. So if you're going from a class 6 or 7 to a class 2, that's a 10-mile-an-hour difference. So do you throw access management away? No, we don't abandon that, because there are going to be places that you do need to have it. If you've got a high-speed arterial corridor where you're optimizing your flow because you've got a lot of volume, you need your access management strategy, because that access management strategy is keeping you from vehicular problems. You just don't need to have people there. You need to be moving those vulnerable users out of that corridor. If you're in a walkable space, those short blocks are a gift. So in terms of roads, this is the opposite side of the spectrum. You want to be buffering your peds and bikes out of the vehicle flow. So you look at something like this, where you got a 6-lane roadway and they put a 4-foot bike lane there because of the bicyclist lobby, but they also have a 12-foot multi-use path out on the side. So the 80% of people who don't want that 4-foot bike lane are going to be out there on that path, and they're perfectly fine. There's trees in between. They're safe. They're out of the clear zone even. This one down here, again, not ideal, but at least you have the option of a multi-use path, so that 80% who aren't comfortable in that bike lane can be over there if they want to be. Not going as fast as the people in the bike lane, but still, if you have an inexperienced bicyclist or a kid, you got a safe place to put them. Is that out of the clear zone? Well, it's kind of a borderline, but you've got enough room in this buffered bike lane. It's almost out of the clear zone. Again, not ideal, but that's the direction to go. This other corridor, the high-speed corridor is in this 4-lane section. The low-speed corridor is actually in frontage roads on either side, and all of the pedestrian and bicycle facilities are on the low-speed corridor, not the high-speed corridor. These are places where you've got a wide road and a clear zone. You don't want the prom queen on the night of prom in the middle of the night to go off the side of the road and hit a tree and die on a road that's posted at 45. This is just the way things are. So we put a realistic speed limit on these roadways, and we try to find a way to move vulnerable users elsewhere. Okay. So problems, we need a transition strategy, and the goal is to either transition things up or down. The worst place to be is in that 25 to 40 mile an hour target speed. So you need to choose whether this is going to be a street or a road over the long term. You may not be able to change it today, but you need to think about what you want it to be over the long haul. This road, a 6-lane road with a beautiful 7-foot buffered bike lane, posted at 45 miles an hour, is not right. This is just not sane. So we really need to rethink these kinds of patterns. It would be much better in this case for you to actually move that curb line back over and give yourself the room for a full multi-use path. We do need both of these types of roadways in the system. We just don't necessarily need both types of users in the same right-of-way. So if you've got a corridor that you've decided from a policy standpoint needs to be a street, and you're going to try to move people down in that street, the strategy is to reintegrate those people into the corridor. And the first thing you're going to try to do is to shift to land use. You need to have enough land use mix in that area that it makes sense to bike in the place. So if it takes 5 miles to get to the closest shopping center, you're not going to ever be able to transition that facility down, because you're never going to get enough people there for drivers to respond to that. So the resolution of your land use mix needs to change. You need to have origins and destinations that are within at least 2 miles and preferably within 1 mile. Now, Amazon is helping us out on this tremendously, because you can do a smaller shopping center with everyday uses. You're getting your exotic things that would belong in a super store. You're getting those on Amazon anyway. So the size of our stores is actually dramatically decreasing, and they're getting scattered throughout the landscape. So the trend is already to move this way anyway. You may have more possibilities than you think, but in that process, you need to visually buffer the pedestrian from the vehicle flow. So you need vertical elements between the roadway and the pedestrians or the bicyclists. That's going to make your bicyclists feel safer, and it's going to give you a narrower corridor width for the drivers. It's going to slow the drivers down too. As you begin to get bicyclists and pedestrians in that corridor, you're going to get an even bigger speed impact. So as your speed comes down, it's perfectly rational to change that speed. And that's the way you actually work from an existing 85th percentile speed, or somewhere between the 50th and the 85th, down to the actual target speed you want it to. By the way, there was just a FHWA study that came out last week, just published this last week. The congestion or the crash modification factor for a side use path is 50%. So you drop 50% of your crash risk when you take your traditional bike lane and you move it over into a separated path. To me, that may actually be worth an awful lot of money. So this is a border area strategy. You're going to use breakaway items. We're not actually protecting pedestrians in the sense of if a driver runs into it, they're not going to stop. But you are actually giving the driver some skin in the game. So if they come off the roadway, they're at least going to scratch their car. And they will respond as if it's a fixed obstacle that they could get hurt by. So it's not ideal, but it's a way to actually transition your corridor. Now, optimizing for throughput, you are going to have corridors that you do want to optimize for throughput. Those are going to move up to a roadway. We don't want them at 35 anymore. We really don't even want them at 40. We want them at 45. And the strategy there is ultimately a reconstruction strategy. You're going to make your lanes as narrow as you can manage them, and you're going to give as much space as you can if you put them in the same corridor, and that's a big if, to trade out what you've got for on-street facilities into off-street facilities. Now, if you're talking about a very dense urban area that's got a lot of walking, you may end up having to do a sidewalk and a bike path off of the roadway. And I've seen bike paths like this in places like Washington, D.C., where they have a 12-foot multi-use path, and they stripe out the middle for high-speed traffic and the outside with a separate color, and the outside is for the lower speed traffic. So you can actually manage two different speeds of vulnerable users in the same space, but it does take some nuance in your design to be able to do that. Here's another way. This is a corridor here in Orlando. It's Mills Avenue. It's a very high-speed optimized corridor, 4 lanes wide with dual lefts in most of the intersections and a fairly short block length. So in theory, you might actually be able to transition this down. You've got some land uses that are very close to the roadway, but a lot of the newer land uses have parking lots and they're separated back from the roadway. And so it's an iffy, and it's a major arterial for the entire region. So you're going to have an awful lot of vehicles in this corridor. So strategically, in theory, you could transition it down, but you probably don't want to because you need the throughput. So what they did instead was they rerouted the bike path over to a parallel facility. And you see this area over here that has the parking lot. There is a fresh market behind that parking lot. So massive grocery store, decent sized grocery store, and an apartment complex and a whole bunch of restaurants, right? So what they did is they moved the bike path behind the grocery store. This is part of the Orlando Urban Trail. It's a very heavily used bike path, and it has a very long connectivity. So you know, almost 10 miles worth of connectivity. And they've moved all of their bike traffic behind the building with bike connections from that bike path all the way up to the front of the building. That puts your bike traffic closer to the entrance of the land use, where you want it to be. I mean, the bicycle doesn't want to have to cross an entire parking lot to be able to get to the front of the store. So you've already got a better location for the bike path, and it's away from the high-speed corridor where it wouldn't be safe. This is a brick street. So the people on this corridor aren't going very fast at all. There's already on-street parking there. And so in a lot of ways, this is kind of an ideal situation where you've taken a very high-speed corridor that had multimodal facilities, and instead of trying to focus all your eggs in one basket, you've moved them out and you relocated your pedestrians and cyclists over to a much safer location. So the strategy here is to shift vulnerable users and optimize for speed in the place where you've moved them out of. Now, you can do that a dozen different ways. Mid-block crossings are going to be very useful. And in those places where you shifted them out of the corridor, you still need to provide places where pedestrians and cyclists can cross. And the idea is to think about these major high-speed corridors as a river, not a stream. So when you have a major river running through your community, you provide bridges. And these micro integrations separate your conflict zones out from the regular roadway and create a ford for the river. It's basically a bridge. But to make that bridge work, you're going to need to make it as obvious as you possibly can. And that means raising your crosswalk up to the level of the sidewalk and creating a speed table. Giving, a pedestrian hybrid beacon or a rapid flashing beacon, an RFB. Making sure that that crossing is as obvious as possible. Putting the transit stop right there where the crossing is, so that as people are crossing, the drivers actually see the reason why they're crossing, that there's an actual physical transit stop with a structure there. Those are really important. Bonus points for artwork. So street art. Now, I will tell you, this requires an FHWA design exception to use it on a state roadway. However, there is a massive benefit in terms of safety. Don't abuse it. So are we going to use integrated everywhere? No. Walkable scale is visually local, and human scale is geographically extraordinarily small. Your response times are going to drop dramatically in those urban spaces, but you'll wear your drivers out. So don't do that. So how small? Quarter-mile blocks. I mean, an urban space is a quarter-mile in diameter. This is my downtown that I just showed you. Winter Park, we have 3 of them in a row, but they are 3 separate areas and they each have a different character. What does that look like in New Orleans? There's all kinds of them. Each one has their own mental anchor. Guess how big the super blocks are in Barcelona? Same size. Gee, happens all over the world. And those transitions are absolutely key. So you want to give a space transition when you're going from an integrated space to a separated space. You give them an area where they perceive that the context is changing, and then a place where you can begin to see things like gateway treatments before you get into the area where you're integrating things in. If you have an area where you're expanding your integrated space, all of a sudden you have 1 quarter-mile block and you need to add another one. Well, maybe you add in another gateway treatment at the end of that other quarter-mile. And you do transitions in between each of those clusters. So as you go from one cluster in Winter Park to the other, there's all of these little cues. You've got these major street furniture things that are going on in between the clusters. You've got a land use change. You've got a major park in that center area. So you can see that you've gone from one neighborhood into another. The transitions over time are just as important. When you're retrofitting a corridor, you're going to have to actually change the land use. That means you need to get your pedestrian systems very consistent throughout the corridor. They have to be ubiquitous. And you're going to have money streets and movement streets. That main drag down Winter Park has a lot of street fronting businesses. That's where Winter Park makes all its money. But there's a parallel road right next to it on the block opposite the park that has a slightly higher speed, almost to the point of being a buffered space. So those are places, if you've got a parallel facility and you need somewhere you're getting your drivers around that facility or around an integrated space, it might be okay to be in that transition speed, at least for a while, just because they're already still very aware. They're very close to a place that's got all of these people in it. Land development code changes could be really helpful. I am amazed at how many new developments come in built by uber urbanist folks that are still very segregated in their land use. Network is your friend, but you need that network to connect real things up. So as development happens, you need to do that. And we are up to our very last Mentimeter. I'm sure there's some people who have had to leave. But if you want to stick around, I would be delighted to have you. And there we go. So, quick quiz. What type of space is this? Is it an integrated space, a buffered space, or a problem space? Separated space or a problem space? What do you think? Anybody got any guesses? We're seeing some buffered. Really? And we have a few Q&As over here. We'll get to those in a second. What's the land use on the side of the road, people? What do you think you're seeing there? That happens to be a ball field right there. So should this be integrated or buffered? If you've got a baseball field where Little League is actually operating, do you want this to be an integrated space or a buffered space? All right, I'm calling it. This one actually is an integrated space, and it's integrated fairly well. I would like to see more between the roadway and the sidewalk, but it is a very narrow corridor. There are ball fields on either side. That's not open fields. These are ball fields. So it actually functions quite well as an integrated space, and people are actually not going that fast. The speed limit on this section is 25, and they actually keep pretty close to it. So this one was a toughie. It's definitely not a problem you want to optimize, sorry. But it may be a problem that you want to calm. We could do more here. Next one. What about this one? Integrated, buffered, or a problem? It's posted at 35, which I will tell you is a fantasy. Yeah, it really, I mean, it's a fantasy. People are not going that slow until you stick a police officer there. There's not enough land use interaction here to actually calm this in the way that you would a main street. You might want to add a little bit between the sidewalk, maybe, if there were breakaway. But you're more likely looking at something that you want to optimize, because this is a very long roadway. This is about 3 miles long, that there's almost no land use interaction. It's all subdivision walls. And so these are the kind of spaces that it's okay for people to go fairly fast. Now they posted it at 35. I still have no idea why. It drives me crazy every time I drive this road. Anyway, next one. This one's much easier. So is this an integrated space or a problem space or a buffered space? And if it's a problem, what do we do with it? We got a problem here that you want to calm. Really, you want to calm it? It is. It's 6 lines wide. What do you think? It's also a major. It's a principal arterial. It's the one road that actually goes from coast to coast. Okay, so I would call this one that you would want to optimize as a problem. So you want to move the pedestrians and cyclists out of this corridor, get them elsewhere, and then you go ahead and optimize this corridor, optimize your signal cycle timings. This is a great place for things like a mid-block crossing. There's a whole cluster of shopping centers here, and it'd be really nice to actually move all your pedestrian facilities out in front of the buildings. Last one. Integrated, buffered, or a problem. And by the way, these are houses. This is a residential area. It does look buffered. These are driveways. Single family driveways. Any thoughts? I will tell you that I think of this as a problem that you need to calm. And the reason I think that is because these are single family housing driveways. Now, I would also like to see a little better land use mix here. There's a set of trees there that's basically an undeveloped lot. And I would love to see like a very, very small shopping center right there for neighborhood uses. But these are literally single family housing that's facing out on the corridor with this massive buffer. It's going to be hard to do that because this is swale drainage. So figuring out how to actually put something there that gives you a visual interruption is not going to be simple, but it can be done. So last few opinion questions. This is a conceptual question. So when you think about roadway design, which categories would you use to divide up the region? So if you were to think about an individual roadway, what kind of category would you put that roadway in? Do you like the street problem road? What about arterial, collector, or local? Would you think in terms of land use, context classification? speed categories, slow, medium, and fast. What about just whether or not there's pedestrians or bicyclists there? Okay. So the engineers are still kind of thinking in terms of that arterial collector and local. That's it's been around a long time, and frankly, there's still advantages to it. Context classification is really powerful. It can do an awful lot of things for you. So cool. Finally, last question, and then we'll go look at some of the questions in the chat. What are you going to use? And this is actually a survey question for FDOT. They really wanted to know, out of what we've presented, what do you think you could actually use in your practice? So, questions. I think I have some concerns with the AM statement. Speeds increase due to congestion. They increase closer to the posted speed. It doesn't increase the percent of people speeding. Good access management is critical for beds and bikes. I am on A1A and Jacks, and the median opening where vehicles stage and peds run across with skateboards and dogs are a big issue. Okay, so it's an interesting point. I was talking to one of the designers, one of the ped bike folks at DDOT. And before I go on with that, PJ is actually putting in the chat the link for the questions that we use for Mentimeter. So if you didn't feel like you had enough time to put in your thoughts on any of these questions, you can go ahead to that chat link, and any of those questions, you can send me that feedback and we'll include it in our final report. He will also, the chat still has the link for the PE credit as well. So PE and AICP credit. So we know that adding a very wide center area is going to increase the speed a bit, but it also makes for a really nice pedestrian refuge. So if you're trying to cross the street and you have a median to refuge in, as you're doing it, you can do it as a 2-stage operation instead of 1. A lot's going to depend on your context. As the speed increases, it's going to be a lot more difficult to integrate those pedestrians safely. If you've got a lot of them there, hopefully you can get your speeds down. I am not against using a brute force treatment if you absolutely have to, but I think you need to be strategic about where you use them. So if you really are not getting your speeds down and you absolutely have to, think about where you need to have them down the most. Places like those crosswalks where you actually level the crosswalk up to the height of the sidewalk. Another place is where you've got a park. So if you've got a park and people are speeding around the park, placing a speed table on both sides of the edge of the park gives you that really brute force treatment right where you need it, and causes people to pay attention more to the park because there's a land use change there. So it's not always cut and dried. And that's one of the reasons why this is not an absolute do this every single time. There's a lot of fuzzy places in this world, and you're going to have to use an awful lot of judgment. I know that's hard. Now, and of course, good access management does allow for good refuges. Removing the bicyclists has also made it so we're never seen or go to the businesses across the street. Oh, okay. That's part of that other question. The MUTCD applies to all roads open to public travel, not just state highways. That's true. The question is, how do you apply what's in the MUTCD? So the MUTCD has a huge amount of flexibility even within the guidance that is already there. So some treatments you want to use in some locations, some you don't in others. I'm not saying you quit using the MUTCD. I'm just saying in an integrated space, you don't have to assure as much consistency in those places as you would in a very high-speed environment where you're trying to do things that are faster than your reflexes can handle. So 6 lanes are a nightmare to try to fix. You need the capacity at peak. At night, it's going to be a death trap. That's one of the reasons why when I see a 6-lane roadway, I'm thinking I probably need to optimize that corridor and I need to find somewhere else to put my pedestrians and cyclists. That's my thought. Now, that may not be everybody's opinion. And if you have 10 engineers in the room, you're going to have 20 opinions. So this is normal. And I appreciate the compliments. So, what are you going to use from this presentation? Ooh, cool. 20 to 40 speed is a problem. That's a great thing to use. 60-foot driver awareness, land use mix. Yes, please fix the land use mix. This dog. Yeah, that's Coco. And, you know, you have somebody who asks good questions. So driver level of stress. That actually would be an interesting metric to use. What kind of stress are we actually using for our drivers? Are there places we really want to stress our drivers? And how long do we want to stress our drivers? Is there a limit in how long a driver can be stressed before he starts making mistakes? Could be. We don't know yet. That's another avenue for future research. So I want to thank you for sticking around this whole time. And I really appreciate your input. I would love any feedback in the future too. There's still the 2 Google Forms in the chat, and we will be here for a moment if there are any more questions. So thank you. Aww. Thank you guys for sticking around this long. Thanks, appreciate it. You know, that's a good point. We really do have some big problems in Florida with very long corridors. And transitioning them is going to be very difficult. I just worked on a study where we had 1,600 houses on a 4-lane divided highway with 1 driveway for all 1,600 houses. Actually, and that driveway dumped onto a 6-lane divided highway. So there are some places that are going to be nearly impossible to fix. What we recommended was a lane repurposing, and, you know, some very, very large multi-use paths. But I am not going to be able to ever get that speed down. It's just not possible. So finding parallel routes, finding other ways for people to get out and around, those are going to be really critical over the long haul. But there may be places that are going to be very difficult to fix until we can actually change zoning regulations. I think there were opportunities in that particular project if we had reallocated the corridor and actually begun to put some retail, small scale retail, local retail on that corridor, there might be some ways to fix that. And you'd have to run a transition where you start with a farmer's market and build that up to more permanent land use. But until you start getting that land use mix at a much finer scale, if you've got a mile-long roadway that only serves houses, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get that speed down. And I've got one question here in Mentimeter. How does this compare with Crow? Oh, Crow is an interesting place, or interesting manual. I've read through the Crow manual. I can't speak to it enough to be to speak more than dangerously. I have it on my shelf behind me. But the Crow strategy really is to make sure that you have ubiquitous facilities for peds and bikes all over. And what the Netherlands has in an advantage over what we have is that their land use is extraordinarily dense. Where they have commercial land use, where it's not an open farm out in the middle of nowhere, it is extraordinarily dense because they just don't have that much land to develop on. And so nearly everything has the kind of land use mix that we never dream of. We really struggle to have that many have our land use at the resolution it needs to be to bike everywhere. And so before we could actually begin to implement strategies that are in the Crow manual, we're going to have, we can do that in places where our land use mix is excellent, where the density is high. It's going to be a real struggle to do that in places like Florida, where our density is really on the whole very low and our land use mix is really bad. And so until we can begin to get the land use mix and the resolution down, it's going to be really hard. That's not to say it can't be done, but it's going to require some massive changes in zoning and the ability to actually flex a bit in terms of what we allow in our single use areas. We're going to have to begin to retrofit those areas with commercial and office and meeting places and parks. So there's reasons for people to actually get out and walk. Until that happens, it's not really useful. It's just hard to get people to go on a bike somewhere when there's no destination to go to. Yes to lane repurposing. Made a build a bypass for the long haul folks. They actually had built in that particular neighborhood. They had a back door that was originally designed into the neighborhood where it would connect out to other roads, and they stuck a golf course in the way. So until the golf course is gone, they're pretty well stuck. Can't fix that. I want to thank you guys for coming. And I think that's about everything for the day. Oh, 100%. Yeah. Well, Florida has some unique challenges. Even when we don't have just flat out land in the way, we have water in the way. And so our overall density is kind of a problem. And we can create small clusters of very dense land, but we always end up with water in the way, a lake or a pond or a series of lakes. And so you try to get a road that runs consistently from neighborhood to neighborhood, and you have to reroute it around the lake or it quits. And then you have a new road on the other side of the lake that has the same name. So it gets to be a little bit confusing with all of that water. That doesn't mean you can't do clusters of very dense, very interconnected land. You just have to be very intentional about it. And we haven't. We just haven't needed to. We will. I think the trend is that direction, but it just hasn't happened yet. All right, I'm going to go have dinner and celebrate. So y'all go have celebration too. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. I really appreciate it.